Our protagonist grew up in a family that, while not wealthy, was always overflowing with warmth. Her father was a dedicated man who gave his all for the family, while her mother always trusted and relied on him. Beneath them were her and her younger brother, both growing up in the complete love of their parents. However, there was one problem that no amount of love could compensate for. She was born far too shy. Her timidness caused her peers to call her a scary freak, while adults criticized her for having no courage at all. Socializing was so difficult that after school every day, her only joy was sitting in front of the TV. And on that small screen, the little girl found her ideal role models, a top South Korean actor couple who had everything from talent and glamour to a perfect love. When asked about their current lives, the happy couple shared that they were busy raising their first child. The actress smiled proudly, revealing her son's name was Seo Ki-hyeon, and affectionately asked if it wasn't a very beautiful name. The husband chimed in, praising that the boy was as beautiful as his name, so much so that he was often mistaken for a girl when he was younger. And then, the television program began introducing the daily life of Seo Ki-hyeon, the son of the famous actor couple. The moment he appeared on screen with wavy purple hair and a charming smile, a whole new world opened up before her eyes. The girl froze, her heart nearly skipping a beat, letting out a wow of admiration as the boy seemed to be greeting her through the screen. That was indeed Seo Ki-hyeon, who inherited all the finest traits from his parents. For the little girl, this was the first time she had seen a peer appear on TV, so different from the usual older guests. Perhaps because of that, instead of noisy adult variety shows, she was completely captivated by this boy's life. Her eyes were glued to the screen, following every moment even though they weren't particularly funny or special. She wondered why, at the same age, that boy could be so mature and calm. If only she were beautiful too. If only she could make friends easily and never feel out of place in a crowd like him. But then the fantasy shattered, and reality abruptly pulled her back when she encountered two classmates and coldly asked what they were doing. Even knowing that a sparrow cannot soar with a phoenix, she still couldn't stop herself from giving a forced smile, thinking it looked fun. The reaction of her two friends was utter confusion, as they stammered, asking what was wrong with her. When she pressed them if they had anything to say, they hurriedly denied it, leaving the girl bewildered, wondering why it was so strange, since she had mimicked Ki-hyeon exactly. Back home, her father caught his daughter staring at the TV again and asked if she was watching Ki-hyeon, while her younger brother yelled that his sister wouldn't let him watch action movies. The mother smiled, remarking that the daughter was just like her father. Once they liked something, they couldn't let go, and the father turned to ask if she really liked Ki-hyeon that much. The girl's eyes lit up, affirming that she liked him very, very much, then excitedly bragged that Ki-hyeon could already speak high school-level English, which was incredible. She also went on about Ki-hyeon hosting a birthday party with 28 friends invited, making her father laugh and acknowledge that the boy was truly a young scholar. To soothe his son, the father promised to buy new toys if he let his sister have the TV, while the mother gently reminded her daughter to sit back so as not to hurt her eyes. Public admiration grew, and Seo Ki-hyeon's family went from occasional guests to fixed faces on the program. Thanks to that, she saw Ki-hyeon more often and his fame grew day by day. But then at some point, everything changed. But one day, the girl sat disappointed before a blank screen, turning to ask her father if her idol Ki-hyeon wouldn't appear today either. The father could only pat her head in comfort, guessing that perhaps because Ki-hyeon had become too famous, his schedule was busier than before. However, that comfort seemed to backfire as the girl pouted, secretly thinking she didn't like him becoming famous at all. During one dinner, the family atmosphere suddenly felt different when Do-young wondered why her father hadn't been turning on the news, as usual lately. The father laughed awkwardly, making the excuse of being tired, while the mother seemed tense, merely uttering Ki-hyeon's name with hidden meaning. It turned out that to hide a certain truth, the parents had been continuously replaying old episodes of Ki-hyeon, to the point where the girl knew every line and every narration by heart. Suddenly one day at school, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the hallway. A classmate was sobbing uncontrollably, while the boy standing with her pointed at Do-young and insisted to the teacher that she was the one who made Jisoo cry. The teacher didn't listen to explanations, only sternly reminding Do-young not to bully friends and to learn how to socialize, leaving the girl stunned, stammering that the truth wasn't like that. Sitting alone on a cold swing, the girl painfully wondered, I only accidentally walked up from behind. Could I really look that scary? In her desperation, the girl could only wonder, if it were Ki-hyeon, what would he do in this situation? Heavy sadness etched onto her young face. The girl was completely submerged in loneliness. But then a determination sparked. She realized she had to go meet Ki-hyeon. She needed a friend like him. And so, that elementary school girl, relying on the neighborhood and school information she had memorized from TV, stood up. Without a moment's hesitation, she set off, determined to find the only light of her life. She was certain that Ki-hyeon would understand her feelings and smile at her, because he was completely different. A fierce hope burned in her heart that just by being close to him, her life would turn a new page. However, the moment she arrived, her eyes suddenly swirled in utter confusion. Standing frozen in the middle of a strange road, the girl stammered, not understanding what was happening. This scene was nothing like what was on TV. And then, a sense of horror enveloped her, cold sweat pouring down as a terrifying truth gradually revealed itself. The harsh truth hit. The little girl was completely lost, standing alone in the middle of a strange street. Panicked, the girl ran headlong without noticing a car rushing toward her. A piercing car horn blared, her eyes widening in horror at the imminent danger. The sound of screeching brakes erupted, and the shiny black car stopped just centimeters away from her. The driver angrily leaned out of the window, loudly scolding her for recklessly rushing into the street. The girl's entire body trembled violently, tears on the verge of overflowing as the man's shouting rang in her ears, saying she had almost been hit. The shock passed, and the girl was left trudging alone on the deserted road, sobbing and sniffing as she went. In her despair, the girl let out a sob, unconsciously calling for her father. But then she froze, a strange thought flashing through her mind. That was not her voice. The sound seemed to come from a small, dark alley nearby, and she curiously peeked inside. Do-young curiously poked her head into the dark corner of the alley, where the sound of melancholy sobbing was coming from. The girl's eyes widened when she recognized a familiar figure huddled in the darkness. It was Ki-hyeon, her longtime perfect idol, now bowing his head and sobbing with a pathetic expression. He looked up at her with soulless eyes, dark circles and exhaustion covering his beautiful face. Without a care for the abnormality of it all, Do-young was overjoyed and said she had finally found him. Casting aside all her innate shyness, the little girl excitedly introduced herself as Chai Do-young. She expressed that she had always watched him on television and truly loved him. But in contrast to his warm image on screen, Ki-hyeon's gaze suddenly became sharp and full of hatred. When she offered to be friends, he responded with a cold curse, asking what the hell she was doing there. Do-young stood frozen, her heart shattering as she realized her idol was nothing like what she had dreamed of. Ki-hyeon clutched his head in agony, repeatedly saying that he didn't want to do those broadcasts ever again. He screamed in Do-young's face that he didn't want to be friends with anyone, and forbade her from calling his name so familiarly as if they had known each other for a long time. A burst of anger erupted. He ranted that it was because of those recordings that weird kids kept following him, then shouted that he hated everything. The boy ran away, not forgetting to leave behind a desperate plea to be left alone. Do-young stood motionless, her face in shock as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The first emotion the person she once admired with all her heart felt for her was not understanding, but utter loathing. In the middle of the dark night, a man's voice calling Do-young's name rang out, filled with worry and urgency. It was her father, frantically running everywhere, his face drenched in sweat and tears at the loss of his little daughter. He looked around wildly with bloodshot eyes, his breath shallow with the fear that the worst might have happened. Meanwhile, Do-young walked slowly and alone on the empty road, her soul now seemingly closed off after the massive shock. In the middle of the cold night street, the father frantically called his little daughter's name when he finally found her standing dazed. But Do-young just stood there like a soulless corpse, her empty eyes looking toward her father without any reaction. Long-suppressed emotions suddenly burst into sobbing. The girl choked out her father's name in infinite resentment. The father's warm arms enveloped her. He gently comforted her, saying everything was okay now and urged her to return home. However, The emotional wound from that horrific encounter was etched deeper into the girl's mind than any other memory, a supreme obsession that she would likely have to carry as a burden for the rest of her life. Years passed, and the neatly hung high school uniform marked a challenging new chapter in Do-young's life. Already shy, she became even more reserved after that incident and decided to lock the door to her heart, no longer having enough courage to speak to anyone. The girl told herself that proactively staying away so as not to make others feel uncomfortable was the kindest thing she could do right now. And when she received her first phone, the girl secretly hoped that this colorful virtual world would help her feel a bit less lonely. Do-young held the phone, accidentally touching a dark region of memory she had sworn never to dig up again. But a fierce curiosity arose, making her unable to resist searching for information about her old friend on the screen. The harsh truth appeared as the press exposed Ki-hyeon's father's affair, shattering the image of the model husband. The tragedy reached its climax with news headlines confirming that Shin Go-eun had taken her own life at home because she could not bear it any longer. The girl realized with shock that she was the only naive one who knew nothing about the storm that had wiped out her idol's family. Only now did she understand why her father always tried to avoid the news and only replayed old episodes to protect her soul. Moving through the cold wind, Do-young silently thanked her parents' protection and sent a sincere wish that the boy from years ago was now happy. A long breath exhaled into the air. She tried to brush away the lingering sadness to continue on the path ahead. At that very moment, a figure with purple hair brushed past her, bringing a sense of familiarity that made her shiver. Her eyes widened in shock, her breath hitching before a fateful encounter she had never dared to think of. Do-young turned around abruptly, her heart pounding as a familiar silhouette brushed past in a fateful moment. Ahead was a student couple walking briskly, and that distinctive purple hair was unmistakable. The teenage boy flashed a radiant smile at his companion, his past beauty now more mature and captivating than ever. Do-young stood frozen in shock, secretly fearing whether he still carried that terrible loathing from the past. She hurriedly hid behind a pillar, holding her breath while observing Ki-hyeon chatting with a girl about not wanting to go to private academy today. Seeing his slightly tired face as he admitted to being distracted by some matters yesterday, Do-young felt her chest tighten. The boy suddenly stopped and turned his head as if sensing eyes secretly watching him from behind. Contrary to his previous smile, Ki-hyeon's gaze now became sharp and dark, recalling the horrific nightmare in the alley years ago. Do-young was stunned, her breath caught in the air thick with tension while facing that terrifying coldness. She could only utter a broken call of the name of the person she both longed to see and feared incessantly. Do-young softly called Ki-hyeon's name, but the call seemed to vanish into thin air before the receding back. The boy walked on casually beside his classmate, smiling and saying he hadn't left anything behind. Standing silent in the street, she bitterly realized that in his mind, her existence had been completely erased. Though her heart constricted, she reassured herself that his remembering nothing of that painful past was truly for the best. Looking at his radiant smile now, she felt relieved to witness her former idol having found true happiness. The small dream of being by his side and sharing with him finally vanished like smoke, leaving her alone. But she had no regrets, for just seeing him living well was enough to close her long-held thoughts. She quietly turned and walked away, shedding the burden of obsession to find peace for her soul. She told herself this would be the last time they met, a gentle full stop to the strange fate from their childhood. However, an unexpected event occurred that left Do-young aghast, cold sweat pouring as she wondered what on earth was happening before her eyes. Do-young looked sideways in shock and wondered if this was a dream as the idol Ki-hyeon was sitting right next to her. The alarm clock rang piercingly at 7:30 a.m., ruthlessly tearing apart the sweet, budding illusion. A hand reached out to silence the noisy sound, pulling the young woman back to the dry reality of a new day beginning. Standing silent in her room, the adult Do-young looked at her phone with sorrowful eyes, seemingly unable to escape the lingering echoes of the dream. Her mother's voice from downstairs, gently reminding her to come down for breakfast, couldn't make that expressionless face brighten up at all. During the meal, her father worriedly asked if her school skirt was too short, and she calmly explained it was because she had just grown taller. Suddenly, Her father burst into tears of emotion, lamenting that his daughter was growing up too fast and had truly become a beautiful young lady. Ignoring her father's sobbing with worry about the day she would leave the family's embrace, Do-young coldly commented that today's soup was too salty. Leaving the modern apartment complex, she left behind her parents' somewhat excessive protection to face the world alone. Standing before the new school, fear from the past rushed back, making her wonder how she could integrate here once again. Do-young walked through the school hallways, hearing faint whispers from peers and only secretly praying her new seatmate would be a quiet person to ease her pressure. A sharp pain in her stomach from excessive stress made her clutch her body, trembling as she watched groups of students buzzing about a certain special character. She froze before the classroom door, bewilderedly wondering why so many people were gathered here, making the space feel suffocating and awkward. The cold fluorescent lights on the ceiling seemed to pierce deeper into the loneliness and alienation of the young girl in the strange school. Lacking the courage to squeeze through the crowd, Do-young chose to flee into the restroom, huddling on the toilet lid and secretly wishing for the class bell to ring soon. Finally, the bell signaling the start of class echoed through the hallways, releasing her from her voluntary imprisonment in the dark. Stepping into the classroom with relief for having bypassed the crowd, she suddenly encountered a tall figure walking out right at the door. A slight collision at the shoulder startled Do-young, her heart suddenly racing at this unexpected contact. The young man quickly apologized and kindly asked if she was okay, leaving Do-young only able to stammer back that she was fine in utter confusion. However, when she saw the face of the person opposite her clearly, her eyes widened in horror as she realized ironic fate had brought the one she feared right before her. Seo Ki-hyeon smiled gently, saying he was very happy, his perfect beauty making the surrounding atmosphere suddenly feel ethereal. Standing paralyzed at the classroom door, Do-young wondered in shock if this was a cruel dream playing tricks on her mind. She rubbed her eyes vigorously, trying to deny the presence of the person she longed to escape from the shadows of the past. Her face distorted in horror as she realized this breath and racing pulse were evidence of an inescapable reality. While Do-young was lost, the surrounding classmates were buzzing in admiration of the famous rookie's outstanding height. The boy interacted casually with everyone, completely overshadowing the existence of the girl standing trembling in the distance. The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly became solemn as the teacher's roll call rang out, slowly approaching the fateful name. Ki-hyeon raised his hand to confirm his presence with a confident demeanor, causing the room to shake once more with cheers. Hiding behind the door, Do-young shuddered to confirm once again that the name Seo Ki-hyeon just called out was absolutely real. The story became even more breathless when the teacher suddenly announced a change in the seating chart to create opportunities for everyone to make new friends. Do-young nervously reached her hand into the drawing box while the teacher asked in a stern voice who was making noise in the back. She burst into joy upon drawing the long-desired window seat. Just one more quiet seatmate, and her school life would truly be peaceful. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine, making her turn pale as she wondered if fate could be so cruel as to seat Ki-hyeon next to her. She tried to brush away that crazy thought, reassuring herself that such a far-fetched thing could absolutely not happen. However, a tall figure suddenly stood before the desk and coldly announced that this was his seat. Before her eyes was Ki-hyeon's unrealistically beautiful face, his lips curling slightly as he offered a polite greeting. Do-young's mind completely froze as she heard the teacher calling other students' names, while her entire body shook from overload. A female student sitting right in front excitedly remarked how lucky she was to still be near Ki-hyeon, putting Do-young in an awkward position. She stole a sideways glance, quietly observing the masculine changes in her childhood friend, who was now so different from before. Ki-hyeon still possessed the same ethereal beauty as years ago, but now his facial features had become much sharper and more defined. Do-young blushed in embarrassment, realizing her old friend was not only handsome but also possessed a height far exceeding her memory. However, a sudden feeling of insecurity invaded her mind, making her stop to reflect. Her eyes were fixed on the female classmate flashing a radiant smile next to Ki-hyeon, wondering how close the relationship between them truly was. A faint fragment of memory from middle school suddenly returned. She recognized this was the girl who had been with him during that brief encounter years ago. Suddenly, that girl turned to look directly at Do-young and curiously asked what her name was, making the atmosphere become extremely tense. Do-young panicked, pointing at herself, stammering as she tried to utter the name that had been buried deep in her heart for so long. The image of the innocent little girl from the past excitedly introducing herself as Chai Do-young suddenly returned like a knife twisting into an old wound. Her face turned pale, cold sweat pouring down as the horrific obsession with her idol's loathing once again surrounded her reality. Unable to bear the massive psychological pressure, Do-young collapsed onto her desk to everyone's surprise, ending the encounter with a dramatic fainting spell. The teacher concluded the first orientation session, telling the class to work hard together and always listen to his instructions. Do-young stole a glance at the friend beside her, silently telling herself that break time was the moment to regain her composure. As soon as the teacher's silhouette vanished behind the door, the silent space was suddenly shattered by noise. A crowd of passionate female students rushed in like a whirlwind, repeatedly calling Ki-hyeon's name with faces full of admiration. A series of questions about the teenage boy's private life and fame began pouring down, surrounding the desks of both of them. Do-young, sitting right next to him, suddenly felt suffocated by the unintentional collisions, silently screaming inside that she was very scared. Contrary to the little girl's panic, Ki-hyeon maintained a terrifying calm despite being at the center of the chaos. The teenage boy casually showed off his perfect profile, his cold face looking as though he was all too familiar with the spotlight surrounding him. The feeling of lonely alienation once again occupied Do-young's mind, making her only able to hang her head in gloom. She withdrew into herself amidst the surrounding strangers, realizing that her presence beside him was no different from a grain of dust among millions of stars. Do-young quietly stood up to leave her seat, her ears feeling muffled as she heard the laughter and the proud confession from a female student saying she was a longtime fan of Ki-hyeon. She bitterly realized that everyone saw his remarkable growth, while she only saw an invisible wall of separation that was growing larger. Watching Ki-hyeon surrounded by the adoring crowd, Do-young sourly admitted that she had never been the only one secretly supporting him. The image of the innocent little girl from the past returned as a cruel reminder. What right did she have to hope for a special place in his heart? The natural behavior of the classmates around Ki-hyeon made her feel even more humiliated by her own extreme shyness. She bowed her head in avoidance, her heart tightening as she automatically assumed she was the only misfit who didn't belong to that teenage boy's radiant world. Despite having been hurt, she still chose to believe the warm version on TV was his true self, trying to dispel the ghosts of the past. A faint smile of contentment appeared. Do-young reassured herself that being his seatmate was already luck far beyond what she deserved. Subdued sadness once again covered her delicate face. She decided to retreat into her shell to protect the last bit of self-respect remaining. Amidst the classroom full of laughter, Do-young resignedly began a new school year in the shadows, accepting her role as an outsider in Seo Ki-hyeon's life. Do-young accidentally dropped her pen on the floor, a small mishap that made her gasp in surprise. Her eyes watched in horror as the pen rolled toward Ki-hyeon's feet, silently screaming why it chose that exact direction. While Ki-hyeon remained motionless, Do-young had to force herself to lean down to pick up the item despite her heart being full of fear. The young girl's face was extremely tense, sweat breaking out as she faced the ironic situation right next to her idol. She made herself small under the desk, holding her breath and reaching out her hand in a desperate effort not to draw any attention. Do-young worriedly told herself that with such a close distance, he would surely have a reason to notice her presence. She peeked her eyes upward, nervously waiting for a reaction from the boy sitting right next to her. Ki-hyeon still kept a face as cold as ice, his hand supporting his chin with arrogance, radiating an atmosphere so dark it was suffocating. Do-young was stunned, her breath halting as she caught that soulless expression and wondered what was truly going on. The terrifying silence was broken when the teacher looked up to ask what was happening in the back, pushing attention to its peak. Ki-hyeon quickly waved his hand to deny the teacher's suspicion and casually said that he had just dropped his pen. Under the desk, Do-young was huddling in confusion while the teenage boy casually leaned down. He gently returned the pen to her with a short confirmation. Ki-hyeon curled his lips into a slight smile, gently telling her that next time if there was anything, she should feel free to ask for his help. Taking the item with a stammered thank you, Do-young breathed a silent sigh of relief and believed the earlier coldness was just her being oversensitive. The pen now sat quietly on her desk at home, bringing with it a wave of completely new emotions. Do-young stood dazed with a blushing face, her heart beginning to race because of the caring gestures of her seatmate. The notification that her father had returned home suddenly rang out, pulling the young girl back to the peaceful reality of her family. The father could not hide his joy, excitedly calling his daughter's name the moment he stepped through the door to show off the gift he brought back. He affectionately handed her a box of cookies and reminded her that she used to want them very much, making the happiness in Do-young's heart seem to double. Touching the secret cookie box, the father softly told his daughter absolutely not to let her younger brother Do-jin know about this. Do-young excitedly cherished the gift in her hands, her eyes sparkling with hope as she asked her father if all of this was truly just for her. The father laughed kindly, affirming that his daughter needed to eat more because she looked a bit thin compared to peers her age. Meanwhile, at school, Ki-hyeon not only made a strong impression on his classmates, but also became the idol of the entire grade. Whether in sports competitions or academics, that teenage boy was always radiant and received passionate admiration from everyone around. Sitting pensively at her desk, Do-young silently felt the kindness and sincere warmth radiating from Ki-hyeon whenever she had the chance to be in close contact with him. The young girl carefully wrote each line of a letter, wondering if, after all those years, an apology for what happened in the past could help her receive forgiveness. Starting the letter with hesitation, she introduced herself as Chai Do-young, the seatmate carrying a heavy heart that had yet to be expressed. Memories returned as she confessed that she had once been a loyal fan, always considering watching his program the greatest joy after school. Do-young painfully admitted in her handwritten lines that years ago, it was her thoughtless actions that unintentionally left the deepest scar in his heart. Do-young sobbed as she embraced the pain, blaming her past self for being too naive and unintentionally placing heavy pressure on her loved one without realizing it. She held the pen carefully, writing each word on the paper, choked up as she sent a belated apology to Ki-hyeon, something she had yearned to say for so many years. And even if time changed everything, she still wanted him to understand that she was still silently watching and supporting him just as she did at the beginning. Do-young's eyes secretly observed the boy beside her, thinking that no matter how many people cared about him, the fact that they became seatmates was a strange destiny. Her gaze stopped at the bright red gift placed neatly in the desk drawer, silently sending a hope for a good new school year beside Ki-hyeon. However, her face suddenly changed color, her eyes tearing up with worry as self-doubt and past fears once again surrounded her mind. She sat motionless like a stone statue, bitterly watching Ki-hyeon happily chatting with another female friend without finding a suitable time to give the gift. That beautiful friend suddenly froze as if sensing a killing intent, letting out a suspicious cry when she caught Do-young's strange gaze. Then she smiled suggestively, publicly asking Do-young in front of the crowd if she had something she wanted to say to the male god Ki-hyeon. Do-young panicked and clenched her hands, cold sweat pouring down as the opportunity to face him came so suddenly that she fell completely into a passive state and couldn't react in time. Do-young stared at the bright red gift in the desk drawer with trembling hands, secretly fearing that if it was a now, she would never find a suitable time to express her heart. Overcoming her extreme fear, she suddenly stood up and thrust the gift box in front of Ki-hyeon, sobbing and shouting loudly that this was her sincere feelings for him all along. Do-young closed her eyes tightly, waiting in extreme shame, her face flushing red after gathering all her courage to carry out a reckless confession right in the middle of class. However, the atmosphere suddenly became strangely silent, making the little girl bewildered, wondering why all the noise around her had abruptly vanished like that. When she peeked her eyes open, she realized dozens of eyes of her classmates were all fixed on the two of them because the attention for the male god Ki-hyeon was already too great. Horror filled Do-young's mind as she suddenly realized her recent action had turned her into the center of scrutiny, something she had never dared to prepare herself to face. A male student suddenly laughed loudly and asked Do-young directly if she was secretly in love with Ki-hyeon, leaving her frozen in shock. Mocking whispers began to rise from behind. They didn't even remember what her name was and ridiculed that she was essentially just an invisible person not worth bothering with. In the middle of the large classroom, Do-young sat dazed, clutching the gift, while enduring the laughter about her sudden confession being considered weird. All the curiosity finally focused on Ki-hyeon's cold, expressionless face, as the crowd began to excitedly ask if he would truly accept the gift from this insignificant girl or not. Do-young's face changed, cold sweat running down as she heard the teasing that if Ki-hyeon accepted the gift, the two would officially become a dating couple. The surrounding crowd began to cheer wildly, repeatedly forcing Ki-hyeon to agree to date the girl standing trembling with a lonely back in front of him. A feeling of guilt surged in Do-young's heart as she blamed herself for being too selfish, fearing that she had pushed Ki-hyeon into an extremely ironic situation. She panicked, not knowing what to do to save the situation, as the confusion clearly shown on her loved one's face made her heart tighten in pain. For someone who always feared the eyes of society like Do-young, the chaotic atmosphere and surrounding laughter were truly a cruel psychological torture. She sat motionless on her chair, feeling dizzy and her heart racing with fear, wanting to vanish immediately to escape this harsh reality. However, a mysterious smile suddenly appeared on the male god's face, as if he had made his own decision before the eyes of everyone. Ki-hyeon's large hand suddenly reached out, gently but firmly taking the gift box from the trembling hands of the little girl. He turned to ask his friends to stop and scolded them for making Do-young feel uncomfortable, making all the classmates disappointed because the teasing was cut short. Ki-hyeon looked at Do-young with a gaze gentler than ever, softly advising her not to worry too much because everyone was just joking, officially soothing her shattering heart. Do-young softly nodded to accept reality, saying she would take this seat as a fateful beginning. The whispers and mocking glares of her classmates vanished instantly thanks to a few brief words of defense from Ki-hyeon. The small girl's heart, which had been racing with fear, began to find peace before the calm demeanor of the boy beside her. A powerful emotion flickered in her heart, making Do-young realize this connection had gone far beyond the boundaries of ordinary admiration. In her eyes at that time, Ki-hyeon was as radiant and perfect as a god, even when he was smiling while giving a gift to another female student. The bustling atmosphere of school closed, giving way to an unusual silence inside her family's small kitchen. Do-young sat quietly at the dining table, while her father diligently peeled apples as a daily habit of caring for his daughter. Sudden tension arrived when her father looked up and asked if she had eaten all the cookies he gave her. The young girl awkwardly lied that she had shared and finished all the cookies with her friends at school and softly apologized to her father. Her father's eyes widened in shock, tremblingly uttering the word friends, as if he had just heard the most absurd thing in the world. The girl hesitantly confirmed the truth, making her father unable to hide his astonishment. He cheered excitedly upon learning that his daughter had finally found her first friends. The father enthusiastically interrogated her for information and even insisted on inviting them home so he could show off his skills by cooking spicy rice cakes for them. She walked silently on the street with a heavy heart because in reality, she still didn't have a single true friend. But since Ki-hyeon accepted the gift, she only then began to feel the definition of happiness. Entering the classroom with a gloomy face, she froze when witnessing the scene before her eyes. Ki-hyeon was sitting opposite and chatting very intimately with another girl named Ji-yeon. Ji-yeon's beautiful appearance and radiant smile made her heart tighten with envy. Hearing that the two of them had been childhood friends since they were little, she understood that the girl held an extremely special position. The gentle gaze and the smile that Ki-hyeon gave Ji-yeon were completely different from when he was with others. A heartbreaking question suddenly appeared in Do-young's mind. Did Ki-hyeon truly like that girl, or did he only find salvation from Ji-yeon right after abandoning her? During the darkest days of his life, when Ki-hyeon completely collapsed due to his family tragedy, there was someone who helped him pick up each piece of his soul. And ironically, the silent hero who helped him stand up after his fall turned out to be Ji-yeon, that female student with a radiant smile. Do-young tried to suppress the pain, telling herself she should feel relieved because at least by his side, he still had such a solid support. But the truth was she was being burned by the fire of jealousy, witnessing the position that originally belonged to her now being replaced by another. Rumors began to spread throughout the hallways. Every student in school insisted that the relationship between Ki-hyeon and Ji-yeon was definitely not simple friendship. They whispered about how the two had been closely attached since elementary school and that their secret dating was an obvious truth beyond debate. Amidst the gloom covering her mind, Do-young suddenly appeared looming behind a group of friends who were gossiping with a chillingly cold aura. A blood-curdling scream rang out, making the whole class turn to look as a female student started in terror before Do-young's expressionless and dark face right next to her. Ignoring the panic and the scrutinizing eyes around her, the young girl glided past like a ghost and casually uttered that she just needed to go wash her hands. Do-young softly apologized and then hurriedly slipped past her classmate, her mind still not over the shock of recent events. She walked lonely along the empty hallway, clearly feeling her own alienation amidst a school full of strange faces. Suddenly, Ji-yeon appeared with a sunny smile, intimately calling Do-young's name, making the small girl start and stop in surprise. When asked about her destination, she awkwardly replied that she had just left the restroom and was on her way back to class. An unexpected twist occurred when Ji-yeon suggested inviting her to buy snacks together because she felt going alone was boring, leaving Do-young stunned, not believing her ears. Carefully observing the other's appearance, she noticed Ji-yeon was not only beautiful, but even the atmosphere around her was extremely radiant. Do-young silently compared Ji-yeon's popularity with Ki-hyeon, wondering why such a perfect person would want to associate with an insignificant person like her. Without letting Do-young react in time, Ji-yeon proactively grabbed her hand and pulled her away excitedly, casting aside all barriers and inherent self-doubt. The school scene appeared brilliant under the blue sky, marking a moment that completely changed her usual lonely life. Ji-yeon smiled and handed her a can of coffee as thanks for coming along, making Do-young feel her heart light for the first time in a strange way. Do-young confusedly accepted the drink, stammering words of thanks, while Ji-yeon smiled and said this was a small gift she gave to every friend of hers. The word friends rang out, making the small girl's chest tighten, silently admiring the kindness and thoughtfulness to a suffocating degree of the person opposite her. She suddenly remembered the early days of being lost in class. Ji-yeon was the only one who proactively stepped closer and dispelled her loneliness. Looking at the coffee can in her hand, Do-young bitterly admitted that such a wonderful person completely deserved to be by Ki-hyeon's side. Self-doubt rose, making her hang her head, her soul once again sinking into dark gloom when seeing herself as just an insignificant person. She secretly observed Ji-yeon, who was casually enjoying the drink, her heart rising with curiosity mixed with envy about their true relationship. Realizing the unusual silence, Ji-yeon slightly turned her head with a worried gaze, looking toward Do-young to seek an answer. But in response was only the bright smile of her classmate, making the small girl even more confused before that overwhelming radiance. The tension reached its peak when Ji-yeon suddenly laughed heartily, while Do-young was trembling with a heart racing because of curiosity. And then she took all her courage to launch a shocking question, directly probing whether Ji-yeon was secretly dating Ki-hyeon or not. Do-young confusedly received the drink, stammering a thank you when Ji-yeon smiled and said that buying gifts for friends was her habit. The word friends rang out, making Do-young stunned. She silently admired the unexpected kindness and thoughtfulness of the person opposite her. She suddenly remembered the early days of being lost in class. Ji-yeon was the only one who proactively stepped closer and started a conversation with her. Feeling the warmth from the drink, Do-young silently understood why such a wonderful person like Ji-yeon could become the closest piece in Ki-hyeon's life. However, self-doubt suddenly rose, making the little girl feel suffocated, silently envying the radiance that she herself could never have. The two sat quietly together on the stone bench, each pursuing her own separate thoughts amidst the silent school space. Realizing the unusual silence, Ji-yeon slightly frowned in worry, directing her clear eyes toward Do-young as if seeking an answer. Do-young gathered all her courage and softly called her friend's name, her voice slightly trembling but her eyes containing a rare seriousness. The tension was suddenly relieved by Ji-yeon's clear laughter. The friend casually joked around, making Do-young even more nervous. And then the little girl took all her courage to launch a shocking question, directly probing whether Ji-yeon was secretly dating Ki-hyeon or not. Do-young walked toward the trash can, intending to throw away the can, but suddenly froze before a haunting sight. Her eyes widened in shock, her breath hitching as she recognized a familiar item lying abandoned amidst the waste. It was the luxury cookie box tied with a pink ribbon, her father's heartfelt gift now cruelly discarded. The young girl stood paralyzed, her heart shattering as she realized her family's sincerity held no value in that person's eyes. She silently bowed her head and walked away, her overwhelming disappointment making her figure appear even smaller and more alienated in the schoolyard. Do-young desperately denied reality, screaming internally that there must be a mistake because Ki-hyeon could never be that heartless. Physical education class began. The teacher asked the class to pair up for volleyball, causing Do-young to fall into a state of panic once more. And then she painfully witnessed Ki-hyeon proactively suggesting to pair with Jaeon, completely ignoring her presence right next to him. She clung to the hollow excuse that it was just an identical box bought by another student, desperately deceiving herself to soothe the wound. However, the teacher's announcement about practicing with the person sitting next to them forced her and that teenage boy into an unavoidable confrontation. The volleyball flew high, tearing through the silent atmosphere of the gym as if signaling an approaching storm. Amidst the whispers of her classmates, Do-young was forced to pick up the fallen ball in utter embarrassment and shame. She stood frozen before Ki-hyeon, the silence between them stretching out like an endless psychological torture. Finally, she softly accepted the request, but the other person's indifference made her heart shatter even further. Suddenly, Ki-hyeon swung his arm and delivered a decisive spike, the sharp sound of impact echoing throughout the room. The teenage boy moved like a brilliant ghost, completely dominating the court and ignoring the existence of the small girl. A cold reception of the ball ended the sequence, exposing an outstanding talent accompanied by a heart of ice. The ball rolled away again. Do-young hurried to pick it up while Ki-hyeon just stood watching with an arrogant expression. His eyes at that moment held not a spark of warmth, only darkness and loathing that made Do-young feel suffocated. Ki-hyeon let out a weary sigh, closing his eyes as if standing next to her was an unbearable ordeal. Ki-hyeon suddenly approached from behind, coldly criticizing that even Do-young's standing posture was having a serious problem. The teenage boy abruptly grabbed her hand, warning that she would get hurt if she received the ball the wrong way, and poignantly pointed out the bruise becoming visible. In his breath that was close enough to be suffocating, Ki-hyeon ordered her to observe his every movement carefully, making Do-young blush with a racing heart. The young girl swallowed nervously, her lips moving as she intended to speak about the secret she had been silently keeping for so long. But Ki-hyeon's expression suddenly turned unusually gloomy. He only uttered a distant confirmation upon realizing the item she mentioned. Do-young gathered all her courage to confess that she had secretly tucked that item between the strings on his pencil case, when no one was looking. A silence enveloped the gym before the teenage boy casually admitted that he had actually read the entire content of that letter. Do-young choked up and asked again to confirm whether it was true that he had understood all her hidden thoughts. Hope flared up intensely. She turned around and asked repeatedly if he had read the letter, then did he still remember her from years ago? Do-young's eyes looked longingly at her seatmate, holding her breath waiting for an affirmation that could heal all the wounds of the past. Ki-hyeon stared intensely at Do-young and coldly remarked that perhaps she didn't understand what she was talking about. Do-young saw through his indifferent face and bitterly realized the truth that Ki-hyeon had never actually read that heartfelt letter. She stood stunned, her chest tightening in a nameless pain as the flicker of hope was cruelly extinguished. Ki-hyeon showed no mercy. He bluntly issued a warning that she needed to stop all these actions immediately. He exposed the fact that he had long noticed the sneaky glances from her seat and affirmed that it made him extremely uncomfortable. The teenage boy ran his hand through his hair wearily, admitting that all this time he had just tried to pretend not to know to save her face. But from now on, he demanded that she absolutely not look at him and never speak unless it was something truly important. Do-young turned away in humiliation, silently scolding herself as a fool for repeating the mistake of the past once again. Regret surrounded her soul as she realized she had selfishly imposed her feelings on others and caused them heavy pressure. In the middle of the vast gym, the lonely back of the young girl silently endured the bitter rejection from the very person she once worshipped with all her heart. Do-young collapsed before the harsh reality, thinking that someone like her would never be able to reach Ki-hyeon in this lifetime. The atmosphere in the classroom suddenly became suffocating under the closed curtains, reflecting the dark mood of the little girl. The boys whispered about the weather, but a lingering sense of unease made them realize something wrong was happening right now. In the middle of the room, A dark cloud loomed over Doyoung as she sat motionless next to Ki-hyeon, who remained as nonchalant as ever. Ji-yeon narrowed her eyes with concern, her amber eyes resting on the weary figure of her classmate drowning in despair. The friend stepped closer, frantically asking what was wrong with Doyoung and if something terrible had just occurred. Doyoung didn't respond, only silently hiding behind her disheveled black hair, retreating into her shell to conceal her humiliation. But then she looked up slightly with swollen eyes, stammering a denial that she was fine, even though her tears kept falling. Ji-yeon was stunned to see her friend's miserable face, exclaiming that she looked extremely bad and could not be considered okay. In an effort to comfort, the friend leaned close to her ear and asked if Doyoung was feeling unwell or suffering from unspoken physical pain. Doyoung told herself that perhaps using exhaustion as an excuse to escape reality right now was the best choice for her. Ji-yeon worriedly suggested Ki-hyeon take her to the infirmary, but Doyoung hurriedly refused, saying she just needed to rest for a bit. Ji-yeon's gaze suddenly became sharp, as if she had seen through the awkwardness and smelled something suspicious from the seatmate. Unexpectedly, Ji-yeon pinched Ki-hyeon's arm hard, making him startle and forcing the teenage boy to snap out of his long-held cold indifference. The friend bluntly scolded Ki-hyeon for being too heartless when seeing his seatmate sick without a bit of worry, leaving him only able to bewilderedly explain. Ji-yeon huffed and turned away, leaving a heavy silence hanging over Doyoung and Ki-hyeon in the middle of the class. When the teenage boy asked, Ji-yeon coldly replied that she would go to the infirmary to get a hot pack and medicine for her classmate. But Ki-hyeon suddenly grabbed her shoulder, demanding Ji-yeon just stay put so he could personally handle everything. A moment later, Ki-hyeon returned with 2 hot packs in hand, leaving Doyoung stunned by this unexpected action. Before Ji-yeon's questioning, he casually said one was for her, revealing a special concern that made Doyoung's heart surge once again. Ji-yeon let out a surprised cry, questioning Ki-hyeon's sudden act of care. The teenage boy sternly reminded Ji-yeon that she had also looked tired this morning and told her to take care of herself instead of worrying about others. Ji-yeon confusedly nodded her thanks, while Doyoung kept her head down in silence to hide the intense inner turmoil. Clutching the bright red hot pack, the small girl heard Ji-yeon's gentle voice asking if the pain had subsided a bit. Doyoung could only softly confirm as she heard her friend ask her to relay a thank you to Ki-hyeon for that timely gift. Ji-yeon was still uneasy. She continued to offer to escort Doyoung to the infirmary or help her ask for permission to go home early if the stomach pain truly worsened. The bitter truth dawned on Doyoung as she sourly admitted to herself that she had just told a blatant lie about physical pain. Her conscience bled as she realized Ki-hyeon was actually the one suffering from pain many times deeper than hers. Doyoung sank deep into regret, telling herself she was cowardly for using sickness as an excuse just to make things easier in front of him. The small girl's face was sorrowful, realizing this lie was the final wall separating her from their warm world. Ji-yeon smiled affectionately, thinking that someone like Ki-hyeon truly deserved to receive love from everyone. Doyoung silently bowed her head, bitterly realizing that only Ji-yeon's radiance could truly warm his frozen heart. The classroom space suddenly became suffocating under the setting sun streaming through the closed curtains. The teacher's voice rang out loudly, asking the class if they clearly understood what he had just taught in the lesson. With only a few short minutes left before school ended, the teacher quickly assigned an important mission, a large group project for next week. The class began to buzz with excitement about the modern presentation topic, the impact of social media on human life. Ki-hyeon propped his chin up with indifference, his mind seemingly drifting to some far-off place instead of caring about grouping. But fate played a trick once more as the teacher demanded the 4 people sitting near each other would become a project team. Amidst the chaos of arrangement, a mysterious question arose about the prolonged absence of a male student named Kwon Tae-oh. Ji-yeon softly asked Ki-hyeon if they intended to keep waiting for the 4th member's appearance, as it seemed he would never show up. Doyoung hesitantly suggested the group should still accept the absent member if he happened to show up halfway. Suddenly, a strange thought flashed through the small girl's head, making her face momentarily show signs of anxious worry. At that moment, the teacher's angry shout rang out, scolding student Kwon Tae-oh for the sin of skipping class once again. The classroom door suddenly burst open, the appearance of an uninvited guest making the entire room go silent in shock. It was the rebel Kwon Tae-oh. He casually looked around the class and then asked where his seat was located. Tae-oh proactively walked toward Ji-yeon, flashing a suggestive smile and asking if he was the one who would sit next to her. Do-young trembled from extreme tension while Ki-hyeon irritably muttered something in total disgust. The young girl was aghast, wondering if there was a secret connection from the past between the radiant Ki-hyeon and that reckless boy. The atmosphere suddenly became strangely suffocating, signaling a turbulent past among the three people standing before her. Ji-yeon calmly spoke up to break the silence, nonchalantly announcing that all four of them would work on the group project together starting tomorrow. Ji-yeon smiled and suggested Do-young keep her schedule after school free so the group could discuss the upcoming presentation together. Right then, Tae-oh smirked provocatively and asked the group at which location they should gather for convenience tomorrow. Ki-hyeon suddenly interrupted with a cold tone, directly asking Ji-yeon if the group could go to her house to work. The teenage boy's face suddenly became dark and sharp, radiating an invisible pressure that made the classroom atmosphere freeze. Breaking the tension, Ji-yeon hurriedly mentioned a cafe near school where she and Ki-hyeon often visited to study. Do-young stood silently beside them, her heart beginning to race at the reality that from tomorrow on, she would have to face him directly in this project. She thought being in the same group was an opportunity to get closer, but the harsh truth was that Ki-hyeon only saw her as a stranger he didn't know at all. The young girl hung her head in insecurity, silently wondering how she would overcome the suffocation of standing before the person who had once humiliated her. Ki-hyeon still maintained a ruthlessly cold exterior, his proud profile seemingly having completely erased her existence. Do-young hurriedly turned away to avoid his gaze, her mind replaying his cold threat that she was absolutely not allowed to look at him ever again. Do-young was stunned to feel a sudden change in the atmosphere, secretly wondering what was happening right behind her. Tae-oh leaned forward, whispering into Ji-yeon's ear with a mocking, suggestive laugh as if asserting some secret. Ji-yeon went silent, her face showing a hint of confusion at the unexpected approach of her groupmate. Witnessing that offensive scene, Ki-hyeon gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening due to the silent rage rising within him. Do-young swallowed nervously in confusion, feeling suffocated as she realized she was caught in a vortex of pressure. A surge of bitterness made her sourly tell herself that she had just burst into a place where she never belonged. Ki-hyeon's gaze became colder and darker than ever, the teenage boy completely enveloped in a terrifying hatred. Do-young suddenly started in horror, her breath stopping when she unexpectedly faced that murderous look from the person sitting next to her. She hurriedly blurted out an apology in extreme panic, trying to shrink back to escape the suffocating pressure of the teenage boy. Ki-hyeon let out a cold confirmation, his proud profile seemingly wanting to end all connection right here. Ki-hyeon's eyes suddenly became dark. He secretly harbored a cruel intention toward all those who were bothering his life. With a terrifyingly cold expression, he affirmed that he only wanted to erase all their traces to find absolute peace. The school bell rang out like a liberation, dyeing the entire school in the brilliant sunset of the late afternoon. Ji-yeon stretched wearily, breathing a sigh of relief because finally a long day full of troubles and pressure had ended. Hearing his friend complain about the mountain of homework, Ki-hyeon slightly curled his lips and invited her to eat shaved ice to dispel all worries. A bowl of bingsu piled high with sweet fruit jam appeared, making Ji-yeon unable to hide her excitement at her friend's sudden care. The girl closed her eyes in delight, not sparing words to praise this as the best shaved ice shop she had ever tried. Ki-hyeon sat opposite, folding his arms and quietly observing his friend's every small expression with a deep, suggestive gaze. He suddenly spoke up, directly questioning Ji-yeon about the content of the secret conversation that rebel Kwon Tae-oh had with her earlier. Ji-yeon casually recounted that Tae-oh wanted to withdraw from the group project, making Ki-hyeon secretly satisfied because things would flow more smoothly without that obstacle. Ki-hyeon frowned thoughtfully, asserting that they could not exclude Do-young because she was also an official member of the group. Ji-yeon casually enjoyed a spoonful of bingsu, commenting that if only the two of them worked together, progress would surely be much faster and easier. The atmosphere suddenly became serious when Ji-yeon directly asked if there had been any friction between him and Do-young. The friend analyzed that Ki-hyeon was not the type to hog all the work, but would usually be the first to divide tasks most fairly. Ki-hyeon silently propped up his chin, secretly admitting in his heart that he could never hide anything from Ji-yeon's sharpness. Unexpectedly, the teenage boy confessed that he liked Do-young because she seemed like a very kind person. The twist left Ji-yeon astonished. She teased that they had only just met, but Ki-hyeon already wanted to get closer because he found the other person cute. The teenage boy's eyes suddenly became deep and mournful, a long silence enveloping his gloomy face. Ji-yeon was confused by her friend's strange reaction, secretly feeling amazed because those words truly did not match his usual personality. Sitting quietly in the cafe, the friend suddenly remembered the past and realized the last time Ki-hyeon showed such clear hatred was during those haunting middle school years. Ji-yeon slightly curled her lips, mentioning their archenemy Kwon Tae-oh, a troublemaker who made the relationship between them extremely tense. She suddenly shifted the focus to Do-young, confessing that despite the short time knowing her, being around this girl made her long to live sincerely. Emotions became complicated as she looked at the bowl of shaved ice, secretly admitting she was intensely attracted to Do-young's presence. Ki-hyeon, sitting right opposite, immediately reproached her for worrying about others, but Ji-yeon only calmly affirmed that it was her truest feeling right now. The teenage boy sank into silence, his face reflecting a sorrowful look as if struggling with selfish thoughts growing in his heart. A cold glare erupted as Ki-hyeon affirmed that that man truly made him feel uncomfortable and he wanted to get rid of him immediately. Right after that, he and Ji-yeon walked together on the sun-drenched path, creating a scene of bond that would make anyone looking on feel jealous. Standing from afar, Do-young froze, witnessing that intimacy, her chest tightening as she realized she would always be an outsider in their lives. Ki-hyeon suddenly stopped in suspicion, slightly turning his head back as if he had just detected a gaze secretly following him. His eyes became cold and sharp, exposing a terrifying aura ready to crush all hope for a reconciliation in the past. Do-young was silent in thought, secretly wondering if Ki-hyeon had truly developed feelings for that radiant friend since he only started to recover his spirit after meeting Ji-yeon. The dark past rushed back, depicting an image of a completely collapsed Ki-hyeon, where his soul was only shattered, colorless fragments. And, ironically, the only person who reached out to help him pick up those ruins to stand up after the fall turned out to be Ji-yeon. Witnessing that truth, Do-young could only bow her head in bitterness and promised herself she should be happy for him instead of letting pain gnaw at her. But the flame of jealousy still flickered, making her realize she could never accept being forever on the sidelines of happiness. Cruel time passed by. The middle school appeared like a new stage where complex relationships began to turn according to fate. Amidst the bustling hallway, Do-young suddenly felt her chest tighten when Ki-hyeon's tall figure unexpectedly appeared right next to her. The teenage boy slightly curled his lips, coldly commenting on the ironic coincidence that they were both assigned to the same class this year. A cold glare erupted through the deep eyes. Ki-hyeon coldly affirmed that that person was making him feel extremely uncomfortable. The teenage boy decisively turned away and walked off, ruthlessly extinguishing every fragile hope and leaving Do-young to sink deep into a shock that was suffocating. Ki-hyeon somberly realized that no matter where he was, scrutinizing eyes always followed him without leaving. That girl's gaze was fixed on him suggestively, not at all like the admiration of strangers. He inherently hated that feeling of being besieged. For his whole life, he had to live like a puppet under the surveillance of public opinion. However, it was exactly that child's eyes years ago that truly made him lose his mind, a persistent disturbance creeping into his very soul. Ki-hyeon casually uttered the name Chai Do-young, the cold sound ringing out as if to tear through the silence of the classroom. The young girl sitting next to him tremblingly raised her hand to confirm, her breath rapid under the invisible pressure from her seatmate. Do-young was stunned, wondering why he could mention the name that she had buried so deeply. The teenage boy propped up his chin in thought, slightly commenting that the name Chai Do-young sounded truly familiar to him. Do-young froze, cold sweat running down as she realized the ghost of the terrible past was beginning to manifest clearly. Ki-hyeon suddenly curled his lips into a sinister smile, secretly asking if she was the annoying child who had once haunted his life. In Ki-hyeon's mind, The image of the naive little girl from years ago introducing herself as Chai Do-young suddenly flashed back, and he thought to himself that even though it was fleeting, he had deeply engraved that name in his heart. How could he forget? Because that day was the worst day of his life, a terrifying memory that could never be erased. It was that haunting gaze and the name Chai Do-young of the girl standing right in front of him now, acting like a curse, ruthlessly digging up the entire filthy past he had tried so hard to bury. Hatred surged in Ki-hyeon's sharp, cold eyes, turning his handsome face terrifyingly dark. And then, from his lips escaped a vicious whisper, saying that her very existence made him sick to his stomach. Leaving behind the deadly atmosphere, the next day, the schoolyard was still vibrant with pink hues as if nothing had happened. That was also the day the group agreed to meet for their project, and Do-young couldn't hide the anxiety and fear on her face. A suffocating atmosphere enveloped them both as Do-young trudged behind Ki-hyeon, not daring to face the desk mate who had just exposed her past. Right then, the remaining two members of the group, Ji-yeon and the rebel Teo, also walked in, breaking the tense atmosphere. However, Ki-hyeon's gaze, sharp as a knife, immediately shot toward Teo, filled with murderous intent. The aggressive guy from earlier immediately flinched, breaking out in a cold sweat under the invisible pressure from Ki-hyeon. Completely overwhelmed, Teo irritably brushed it off, yelling to just let it be, because he was going to get scolded anyway. The four of them stood in the middle of the empty classroom, a project group with complicated relationships. Could they overcome this assignment together? Finally, the whole group gathered at a coffee shop to start their first meeting. Ji-yeon, with her leadership qualities, quickly suggested dividing the topic into pros and cons, then volunteered to do the presentation. Ki-hyeon also immediately assigned tasks, saying he would make the slides and Ji-yeon would find data, then turned to ask the group if anyone knew how to use PowerPoint. All eyes silently turned to Do-young and Teo, the two members considered the most unstable and unreliable in the group. Even Ki-hyeon, who had just asked the question, could only mumble awkwardly in the face of this dilemma. Ji-yeon, the only one to break the silence, turned and asked Do-young in a friendly manner which part she wanted to do. Do-young startled, stammering to answer while her eyes unconsciously darted toward Ki-hyeon, who still maintained an ice-cold attitude. Regaining her composure, she offered to take on the research part, making the excuse that she didn't have a computer at home so it would be hard to make the PowerPoint, and Ji-yeon happily agreed right away. Ki-hyeon, who had been silently typing the whole time, finally spoke up with a terse, indifferent whatever. Then his gaze shifted to Teo, who was yawning widely in boredom, and thought to himself that this was someone he trusted even less than Do-young. A meaningful smile appeared on Ki-hyeon's lips, and he decided to assign Teo the task of assisting Do-young with the research, considering the delegation complete. Immediately, Teo stood up abruptly and announced his departure, ignoring Ji-yeon's panicked shouts that they hadn't even started working yet. The reckless guy turned back and snapped, saying that since everyone had given him the research part, he could just go home and do it, couldn't he? Ji-yeon angrily fired back, but Ki-hyeon coldly intervened, telling her not to waste her energy on that guy. But right after that, he turned to Ji-yeon, casually asking if she wanted to go home too since the tasks were assigned, leaving her so stunned that she cried out in shock. Ji-yeon immediately objected, hugging Do-young tightly and emphasizing that they all came here for group work, while Ki-hyeon merely stated casually that he was just asking. Then she turned to Do-young seeking agreement, earnestly asking if she would stay with them. Put in a dilemma, Do-young's face turned pale from extreme tension. Ultimately, under pressure from both, she could only give a tiny, hesitant nod of agreement. Seeing that, Ji-yeon cheered happily, a complete contrast to Ki-hyeon, who was still coldly focused on his laptop. Resting his chin on his hand to observe, Ki-hyeon silently judged that Ji-yeon really had no tact at all. He also realized something. It seemed his best friend genuinely liked Do-young a lot. According to Ki-hyeon, there was something pure and naive about Do-young that others lacked, and that was exactly what attracted Ji-yeon. However, Ki-hyeon narrowed his eyes mockingly, secretly sneering that this pure look actually just made Do-young appear totally clueless and empty-headed. A wave of worry suddenly arose. He feared that if this continued, Ji-yeon would drag Do-young everywhere, and things would get messed up again. Ji-yeon accidentally brought up the past when she asked Ki-hyeon if he had looked at the gift Do-young gave him. Contrary to his cold demeanor earlier, Ki-hyeon smiled and said he had eaten it all, and it was very delicious, making Ji-yeon couldn't help but feel jealous. But when Ji-yeon mentioned the presence of an accompanying letter, Do-young's face instantly changed color for fear that her hidden feelings would be exposed. Ji-yeon curiously pressed to know what was inside the letter and wanted him to share the secret, while Ki-hyeon only responded with a highly suspicious look. Do-young started to panic, trying to find an explanation, but Ji-yeon's close approach made her completely lose her bearings and fall into a dead end. Unable to bear the overwhelming psychological pressure, she suddenly burst into sobbing tears, making Ji-yeon panic, not understanding what she had done wrong. Amidst her choked sobs, Do-young begged her friend not to ask any more about that letter because it was truly too embarrassing for her. Witnessing this tearful drama, Ki-hyeon could only sigh wearily and let out a tired exclamation. His eyes became sharp and cold, containing a harsh judgment reserved for the girl across from him. He inwardly mocked that she was grown up and no longer an elementary school kid, yet she could still cry so pitifully over something so trivial. Ki-hyeon suddenly grabbed Do-young's arm, coldly telling her she should go outside for some fresh air, leaving Ji-yeon staring after them in bewilderment. Then, he casually turned to tell Ji-yeon that he was going to order more cake, leaving Do-young frozen from the pressure-filled touch. Ji-yeon smiled comfortingly, saying that sweets would help Do-young's mood improve, but the poor girl could only stammer a response in utter panic. The sunset dyed a corner of the street red, as if signaling a stormy conversation and truths about to be exposed. Standing quietly in a deserted corner, Ki-hyeon and Do-young faced each other, a thick atmosphere of tension enveloping them both. Ki-hyeon ran a hand through his hair looking exhausted, silently blaming himself for being too incompetent at hiding his true feelings and fearing that Ji-yeon had realized something. His eyes became deep and calculating. He told himself that now was absolutely not the right time to push her further away. Suddenly lowering his voice to apologize, Ki-hyeon brought up the fact that he had had to live under public scrutiny since he was a child. He bitterly recounted that among the gifts he once received, someone had heartlessly hidden a hidden camera, forcing him to always live in extreme vigilance toward everything around him. Because he had A-list actors for parents, Ki-hyeon had to grow up with the ghost of crazy stalkers, and that was the exact reason he never dared to accept any gift from strangers. Do-young shockingly realized the obvious truth that, from Ki-hyeon's perspective, the act of a stranger like her suddenly showing up and giving a gift was indeed extremely suspicious. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped closer and directly asked if she had known him since they were both kids. That sentence made Do-young freeze as she realized that he, too, had never forgotten her haunting presence in the past. Ki-hyeon continued to confess that at his most sensitive time, the appearance of a stranger like her had genuinely made him feel terrified. Overwhelming guilt made Do-young blush deeply with shame. She was stunned and blamed herself for her abruptness back then. Unable to hold back anymore, she bowed her head in apology and expressed ultimate remorse for not caring about his feelings at that time. She tearfully explained that she was originally just a loyal fan since childhood, which was why she knew all the information about him. But since Ki-hyeon had absolutely no idea who she was, it was completely understandable that she would be misunderstood as a scary creep. Ki-hyeon flashed a meaningful smile and secretly mocked Do-young's lack of tact, even as she tried her best to deny that she was a stalker pervert. Do-young gathered her final bit of courage, softly confessing that she really liked him, and that was all the truth she wanted to say. Ki-hyeon repeated that confession with a highly skeptical look, directly forcing Do-young to face the fact that she had just said she liked him right to his face. She froze, her mind going completely blank upon realizing she had just slipped and blurted out her most hidden secret at an unexpected moment. Do-young's face turned as red as if it were about to explode. The shame and humiliation enveloped her whole body, leaving her nowhere to hide. In a state of extreme panic, she frantically waved her hands in denial and assured him he didn't need to feel pressured, silently cursing herself for this reluctant confession. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped in close, asserting that he always knew he received a lot of admiration and directly asking if she was well aware of that too. With his inherent arrogance and confidence, He stared piercingly at her and said that only a blind person wouldn't notice his irresistible charm. The distance between the two of them was now suffocatingly close. Ki-hyeon slightly tilted his head and asked Do-young if she agreed with that thought. Taking advantage of the little girl's peak fluster, he proposed she fulfill a request for him, leaving Do-young to helplessly stammer a question back. Mesmerized by the deep gaze of her secret crush, Do-young silently promised herself that if it was a request from him, she was willing to do anything. Ki-hyeon ordered Do-young to stay away from Jaeon, while revealing a shocking secret that he had secretly been in love with his best friend for the past 5 years. He coldly demanded Do-young not to question why, because deep down he always craved to be the only one standing next to John. Meanwhile, Do-young painfully admitted that she also couldn't stand seeing anyone approach Ki-hyeon besides herself. On the other side, Jaeon flashed a radiant smile and thought to herself that it was Ki-hyeon who made her want to live more true to her heart. But Ki-hyeon was drowning in a mess, feeling himself being pulled toward an incredibly complex and unpredictable emotion. He admitted he was slowly losing his cool because this was the first time hearing Jaeon speak such suggestive confessions. Back to reality, Do-young could only stammer apologies in front of the aggressive look of the male idol standing right before her. Ki-hyeon smirked and asked back what she was apologizing for, while his gaze relentlessly pressured the poor girl. Do-young haltingly brought up that she had accidentally made a promise to Jaeon, causing Ki-hyeon to instantly change his expression and interrogate her about what kind of promise it was. He was stunned hearing Do-young talk about Jaeon's plan for the 4-person group to hang out together, a scenario completely opposite to his possessive desires. Ki-hyeon was so shocked he broke into a cold sweat hearing Do-young repeat Jaeon's words about the 3 of them hanging out. Unable to hide his agitation, he pressed to ask if Jaeon really said that right after he left. Ki-hyeon held his face in sheer helplessness, silently regretting his wrong move in directly asking Do-young to stay away from Jaeon without anticipating their bond. He backed the little girl into a corner, snapping at her to ask if fulfilling his request was that difficult even though she had just said she liked him earlier. Do-young looked agonizingly straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes and blurted out that she knew full well how huge his unrequited love for Jaeon was. She empathetically said she understood the feeling of wanting to be with the one you love, leaving Ki-hyeon stunned to hear that phrase coming from her mouth. Do-young bitterly admitted it was a romantic way of looking at it, but to her, Jaeon was the very first true friend she had ever had in her life. Under the glowing sunset sky, she affirmed that this was a huge opportunity for her to change, and she absolutely had no intention of coming between the two of them. Do-young's eyes brimmed with sincerity as she expressed that her biggest dream in life was simply to see him happy. Ki-hyeon sank into silence at the apology and the promise to fix everything that upset him, leaving a contemplative pause between 2 heavily scarred souls. In Ki-hyeon's mind, the image of the naive little girl from years ago introducing herself as Chai Do-young suddenly flashed back, and he thought to himself that even though it was fleeting, he had deeply engraved that name in his heart. How could he forget? Because that day was the worst day of his life, a terrifying memory that could never be erased. It was that haunting gaze and the name Chai Do-young of the girl standing right in front of him now, acting like a curse, ruthlessly digging up the entire filthy past he had tried so hard to bury. Hatred surged in Ki-hyeon's sharp, cold eyes, turning his handsome face terrifyingly dark. And then, from his lips escaped a vicious whisper, saying that her very existence made him sick to his stomach. Leaving behind the deadly atmosphere, the next day, the schoolyard was still vibrant with pink hues as if nothing had happened. That was also the day the group agreed to meet for their project, and Do-young couldn't hide the anxiety and fear on her face. A suffocating atmosphere enveloped them both as Do-young trudged behind Ki-hyeon, not daring to face the desk mate who had just exposed her past. Right then, the remaining 2 members of the group, Jaeon and the rebel Teo, also walked in, breaking the tense atmosphere. However, Ki-hyeon's gaze, sharp as a knife, immediately shot toward Teo, filled with murderous intent. The aggressive guy from earlier immediately flinched, breaking out in a cold sweat under the invisible pressure from Ki-hyeon. Completely overwhelmed, Teo irritably brushed it off, yelling to just let it be, because he was going to get scolded anyway. The 4 of them stood in the middle of the empty classroom, a project group with complicated relationships, Could they overcome this assignment together? Finally, the whole group gathered at a coffee shop to start their first meeting. Ji-yeon, with her leadership qualities, quickly suggested dividing the topic into pros and cons, then volunteered to do the presentation. Ki-hyeon also immediately assigned tasks, saying he would make the slides and Ji-yeon would find data, then turn to ask the group if anyone knew how to use PowerPoint. All eyes silently turned to Do-young and Tae-oh, the two members considered the most unstable and unreliable in the group. Even Ki-hyeon, who had just asked the question, could only mumble awkwardly in the face of this dilemma. Ji-yeon, the only one to break the silence, turned and asked Do-young in a friendly manner which part she wanted to do. Do-young startled, stammering to answer while her eyes unconsciously darted toward Ki-hyeon, who still maintained an ice-cold attitude. Regaining her composure, she offered to take on the research part, making the excuse that she didn't have a computer at home so it would be hard to make the PowerPoint, and Ji-yeon happily agreed right away. Ki-hyeon, who had been silently typing the whole time, finally spoke up with a terse, indifferent whatever. Then his gaze shifted to Tae-oh, who was yawning widely in boredom, and thought to himself that this was someone he trusted even less than Do-young. A meaningful smile appeared on Ki-hyeon's lips, and he decided to assign Tae-oh the task of assisting Do-young with the research, considering the delegation complete. Immediately, Tae-oh stood up abruptly and announced his departure, ignoring Ji-yeon's panicked shouts that they hadn't even started working yet. The reckless guy turned back and snapped, saying that since everyone had given him the research part, he could just go home and do it, couldn't he? Ji-yeon angrily fired back, but Ki-hyeon coldly intervened, telling her not to waste her energy on that guy. But right after that, he turned to Ji-yeon, casually asking if she wanted to go home too since the tasks were assigned, leaving her so stunned that she cried out in shock. Ji-yeon immediately objected, hugging Do-young tightly and emphasizing that they all came here for group work, while Ki-hyeon merely stated casually that he was just asking. Then she turned to Do-young seeking agreement, earnestly asking if she would stay with them. Put in a dilemma, Do-young's face turned pale from extreme tension. Ultimately, under pressure from both, she could only give a tiny, hesitant nod of agreement. Seeing that, Ji-yeon cheered happily, a complete contrast to Ki-hyeon, who was still coldly focused on his laptop. Resting his chin on his hand to observe, Ki-hyeon silently judged that Ji-yeon really had no tact at all. He also realized something. It seemed his best friend genuinely liked Do-young a lot. According to Ki-hyeon, there was something pure and naive about Do-young that others lacked, and that was exactly what attracted Ji-yeon. However, Ki-hyeon narrowed his eyes mockingly, secretly sneering that this pure look actually just made Do-young appear totally clueless and empty-headed. A wave of worry suddenly arose. He feared that if this continued, Ji-yeon would drag Do-young everywhere and things would get messed up again. Ji-yeon accidentally brought up the past when she asked Ki-hyeon if he had looked at the gift Do-young gave him. Contrary to his cold demeanor earlier, Ki-hyeon smiled and said he had eaten it all and it was very delicious, making Ji-yeon couldn't help but feel jealous. But when Ji-yeon mentioned the presence of an accompanying letter, Do-young's face instantly changed color for fear that her hidden feelings would be exposed. Ji-yeon curiously pressed to know what was inside the letter and wanted him to share the secret, while Ki-hyeon only responded with a highly suspicious look. Do-young started to panic, trying to find an explanation, but Ji-yeon's close approach made her completely lose her bearings and fall into a dead end. Unable to bear the overwhelming psychological pressure, she suddenly burst into sobbing tears, making Ji-yeon panic, not understanding what she had done wrong. Amidst her choked sobs, Do-young begged her friend not to ask any more about that letter because it was truly too embarrassing for her. Witnessing this tearful drama, Ki-hyeon could only sigh wearily and let out a tired exclamation. His eyes became sharp and cold, containing a harsh judgment reserved for the girl across from him. He inwardly mocked that she was grown up and no longer an elementary school kid, yet she could still cry so pitifully over something so trivial. Ki-hyeon suddenly grabbed Do-young's arm, coldly telling her she should go outside for some fresh air, leaving Ji-yeon staring after them in bewilderment. Then, he casually turned to tell Ji-yeon that he was going to order more cake, leaving Do-young frozen from the pressure-filled touch. Ji-yeon smiled comfortingly, saying that sweets would help Do-young's mood improve, but the poor girl could only stammer a response in utter panic. The sunset dyed a corner of the street red, as if signaling a stormy conversation and truths about to be exposed. Standing quietly in a deserted corner, Ki-hyeon and Do-young faced each other, a thick atmosphere of tension enveloping them both. Ki-hyeon ran a hand through his hair looking exhausted, silently blaming himself for being too incompetent at hiding his true feelings and fearing that Jaeon had realized something. His eyes became deep and calculating. He told himself that now was absolutely not the right time to push her further away. Suddenly lowering his voice to apologize, Ki-hyeon brought up the fact that he had had to live under public scrutiny since he was a child. He bitterly recounted that among the gifts he once received, someone had heartlessly hidden a hidden camera, forcing him to always live in extreme vigilance toward everything around him. Because he had A-list actors for parents, Ki-hyeon had to grow up with the ghost of crazy stalkers, and that was the exact reason he never dared to accept any gift from strangers. Do-young shockingly realized the obvious truth that, from Ki-hyeon's perspective, the act of a stranger like her suddenly showing up and giving a gift was indeed extremely suspicious. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped closer and directly asked if she had known him since they were both kids. That sentence made Do-young freeze as she realized that he, too, had never forgotten her haunting presence in the past. Ki-hyeon continued to confess that at his most sensitive time, the appearance of a stranger like her had genuinely made him feel terrified. Overwhelming guilt made Do-young blush deeply with shame. She was stunned and blamed herself for her abruptness back then. Unable to hold back anymore, she bowed her head in apology and expressed ultimate remorse for not caring about his feelings at that time. She tearfully explained that she was originally just a loyal fan since childhood, which was why she knew all the information about him. But since Ki-hyeon had absolutely no idea who she was, it was completely understandable that she would be misunderstood as a scary creep. Ki-hyeon flashed a meaningful smile and secretly mocked Do-young's lack of tact, even as she tried her best to deny that she was a stalker pervert. Do-young gathered her final bit of courage, softly confessing that she really liked him, and that was all the truth she wanted to say. Ki-hyeon repeated that confession with a highly skeptical look, directly forcing Do-young to face the fact that she had just said she liked him right to his face. She froze, her mind going completely blank upon realizing she had just slipped and blurted out her most hidden secret at an unexpected moment. Do-young's face turned as red as if it were about to explode. The shame and humiliation enveloped her whole body, leaving her nowhere to hide. In a state of extreme panic, she frantically waved her hands in denial and assured him he didn't need to feel pressured, silently cursing herself for this reluctant confession. Ki-hyeon suddenly stepped in close, asserting that he always knew he received a lot of admiration and directly asking if she was well aware of that too. With his inherent arrogance and confidence, he stared piercingly at her and said that only a blind person wouldn't notice his irresistible charm. The distance between the two of them was now suffocatingly close. Ki-hyeon slightly tilted his head and asked Do-young if she agreed with that thought. Taking advantage of the little girl's peak fluster, he proposed she fulfill a request for him, leaving Do-young to helplessly stammer a question back. Mesmerized by the deep gaze of her secret crush, Do-young silently promised herself that if it was a request from him, she was willing to do anything. Ki-hyeon ordered Do-young to stay away from Jaeon, while revealing a shocking secret that he had secretly been in love with his best friend for the past 5 years. He coldly demanded Do-young not to question why, because deep down he always craved to be the only one standing next to John. Meanwhile, Do-young painfully admitted that she also couldn't stand seeing anyone approach Ki-hyeon besides herself. On the other side, Jaeon flashed a radiant smile and thought to herself that it was Ki-hyeon who made her want to live more true to her heart. But Ki-hyeon was drowning in a mess, feeling himself being pulled toward an incredibly complex and unpredictable emotion. He admitted he was slowly losing his cool because this was the first time hearing Jaeon speak such suggestive confessions. Back to reality, Do-young could only stammer apologies in front of the aggressive look of the male idol standing right before her. Ki-hyeon smirked and asked back what she was apologizing for, while his gaze relentlessly pressured the poor girl. Do-young haltingly brought up that she had accidentally made a promise to Ji-yeon, causing Ki-hyeon to instantly change his expression and interrogate her about what kind of promise it was. He was stunned hearing Do-young talk about Ji-yeon's plan for the four-person group to hang out together, a scenario completely opposite to his possessive desires. Ki-hyeon was so shocked he broke into a cold sweat hearing Do-young repeat Ji-yeon's words about the three of them hanging out. Unable to hide his agitation, he pressed to ask if Ji-yeon really said that right after he left. Ki-hyeon held his face in sheer helplessness, silently regretting his wrong move in directly asking Do-young to stay away from Ji-yeon without anticipating their bond. He backed the little girl into a corner, snapping at her to ask if fulfilling his request was that difficult even though she had just said she liked him earlier. Do-young looked agonizingly straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes and blurted out that she knew full well how huge his unrequited love for Ji-yeon was. Looking at the results on the laptop, Ji-yeon humorously asked the group if their presentation outcome looked pretty good. Then she held up her phone to show off Taeo's document, making Do-young ask again in astonishment just to be sure if he really did it. Even though the data wasn't perfect, Ji-yeon still smiled and confirmed that the stubborn guy finally decided to get to work. Ki-hyeon pondered with a highly suspicious look, silently evaluating this highly unusual contribution from his rival. Night quickly fell, leaving only the dim streetlights illuminating the deserted street under a gray, cloudy sky. Do-young trudged along the empty road leading home, the late-night silence making her small figure seem even more lonely. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks when she caught sight of a silhouette in the dark corner, suspiciously wondering who that mysterious person could be. Cold sweat began to pour down her visibly panicked face. Do-young could only stand rooted to the spot in fear. It turned out to be Kwon Tae-oh, who casually slipped his hands into his pockets and asked what she was doing out on the street at this hour. He smirked and stepped closer, mocking her bravery for daring to show up in such a quiet and deserted place. Do-young fearfully gripped her backpack straps, nervously asking Tae-oh why he was here and how he knew her home address. Faced with her harsh questioning, Tae-oh looked a bit dazed and could only blurt out a clumsy response. He awkwardly scratched his cheek, explaining that the whole thing was just a mere coincidence. But the little girl was not appeased. She snapped at him, demanding a clear explanation of the situation. Seeing the tension, Tae-oh hastily waved his hands to deny any bad intentions and mentioned that he had seen her at the tutoring center before. He admitted that having Ki-hyeon by her side at that time made him uncomfortable, while a terrified Do-young secretly wondered if she had been stalked all this time. Tae-oh frustratedly scratched his head in confusion, complaining that her defensive attitude was exactly what was making him feel annoyed. Unexpectedly, he asked back if it was possible she didn't have feelings for him at all, leaving Do-young completely dumbfounded by those words. He fiercely asserted that her using the group project as an excuse to text him privately was the clearest proof of these feelings. Tae-oh delivered the final blow by saying Ki-hyeon was completely fooled, leaving Do-young alone in the dark with the fear of a disastrous misunderstanding. Ji-yeon began to kindle some hope when she saw the serious progress report messages from the stubborn friend Kwon Tae-oh. However, at the same time, Tae-oh continuously attached teasing pictures and insisted that this little bunny looked exactly like her. Personal private messages kept pouring in, ranging from asking about her schedule to scrutinizing every single one of her social media posts. Do-young walked tiredly through the night, telling herself that everything would be fine as long as she drew a clear line, then texted that she was going to sleep to end the conversation. The next morning, the hustle and bustle of life resumed as buses busily rolled down the streets to take students to school. As soon as she reached the school gate, Do-young brightly said good morning to Ki-hyeon, making him a bit surprised by her early appearance. Ki-hyeon smiled faintly and turned to look at his friend enthusiastically approaching him, creating a perfectly harmonious scene under the morning sun. They both blended into the crowd of people rushing through the school gates to start a new day of studying. Do-young endlessly told cheerful stories, making the atmosphere between the two of them comfortable and full of laughter. Suddenly, Ki-hyeon narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. He looked deep into Do-young's eyes and softly asked a question full of suspicion about something. Ki-hyeon noticed something unusual and asked Do-young if something had happened, making her blankly ask him back. He remarked that she looked a bit tired, but she only forced a smile to deny it and asked why he thought so. Do-young let out an awkward gasp as anxious beads of sweat formed on her face, which was desperately trying to maintain a calm facade. She laughed it off, explaining that she stayed up late studying last night, which was why she looked so haggard. Not forgetting to praise Ki-hyeon's perceptiveness, she playfully tapped his shoulder to lighten the mood. Do-young looked at her phone and worriedly asked if her skin looked terribly bad to him today. Faced with those explanations, Ki-hyeon remained silent with a sharp, skeptical gaze as if he could see right through everything. Class began as sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, the clock striking the start of the lesson in silence. While Ki-hyeon rested his head on the desk to sleep, Jaeon, sitting in front, turned around with full curiosity to observe them both. With a look of clear suspicion, the girl silently wondered about the unusual developments unfolding before her eyes. Ki-hyeon exhaustedly dropped his head onto the desk, making Do-young secretly worry about why his mood was so terrible today. Confusion and sorrow enveloped her mind, leaving the little girl to just sit blankly with a face full of melancholy. She began to deduce that the reason for Ki-hyeon's gloominess since early morning definitely had something to do with her friend Jun. Do-young quietly observed Jaeon from behind and wondered if something had actually happened between the two of them. When hearing a classmate report that the teacher was looking for him, Ki-hyeon only slightly raised his head and replied lifelessly. Despite the invitation to play soccer after the lunch break, he still bluntly refused and declared that he wouldn't be participating today. Seeing his friends begging him because they were short on players, Do-young suddenly perked up with a determined gaze, secretly thinking this was the perfect opportunity for her. She gathered all her courage to proactively call Jaeon's name, causing her friend, who was sitting quietly, to startle and turn around in astonishment. Do-young invited Jaeon to go to the fast food restaurant together for a chance to repay the favor of the canned coffee she received last time. Although Jaeon laughed and said it wasn't a big deal, Do-young still felt apologetic and insisted that she genuinely wanted to return the kindness. Do-young softly expressed that she really just wanted to go to the fast food restaurant with Fan. Her calling out her name made Jaeon jump in surprise, hastily covering her mouth to hide her fluster. The two quickly reached an agreement and excitedly urged each other to get going right away. Jaeon smiled and told her friend to wait a moment so she could go to the restroom before they both left the classroom. Right at this moment, Ki-hyeon's tall figure suddenly appeared at the classroom door with a cold, oppressive demeanor. He stood silently observing with a sharp gaze, seemingly quietly calculating something in his mind. Ki-hyeon spoke up to ask about Jaeon's whereabouts and seemed extremely surprised when he heard Do-young mention the fast food restaurant. His eyes suddenly turned sharp and cold as he interrogated her again to confirm if it was really just the two of them planning to go together. Not letting the other party react in time, Ki-hyeon coldly announced that he would be tagging along too, leaving Do-young utterly stunned. Do-young clearly showed uneasiness on her face. She told herself that she had to find a way to talk clearly with Hyeon about this soon. Ki-hyeon looked deep into Do-young's eyes and coldly pressed her on whether she was feeling worried about Jun. Standing huddled by the lockers, Do-young mustered up the courage to say that she would go ask Hyeon what was really going on. But Ki-hyeon immediately closed in menacingly, mocking why Jaeon would open up to a stranger like her and demanding to know who she thought she was. Deep down, he began to feel it was strange that this girl seemed to thoroughly understand the troubles he was facing. Do-young shakily explained that perhaps girls would find it easier to share such private thoughts with each other. Looking at his face, she sincerely expressed that she truly wanted to help him shoulder some of the pressure. Ki-hyeon slightly tilted his head and coldly agreed to let her do whatever she wanted, leaving Do-young undeniably amazed. He casually walked away, not forgetting to drop a sarcastic remark that he had absolutely no expectations of her efforts whatsoever. Just then, Jaeon happily poked her head out the classroom door and called out loudly, urging Do-young to hurry up and go with her before it got late. Under the bright sunlight enveloping the school building, a new plan quietly began with highly unpredictable developments. Sitting on the stone bench in the schoolyard, Jaeon faintly smiled, saying her thanks, and mentioned she would enjoy this drink very much. Do-young hesitated for a moment before suddenly calling Jaeon's name, making her friend tilt her head and respond ever so gently. The little girl gathered all her courage to ask if something had happened to Jaeon today, instantly causing the atmosphere to turn somber. A completely astonished Jaeon leaned in close, pressing to know how Do-young could figure out her hidden feelings so quickly. She incessantly praised Do-young's perceptiveness and admitted that usually only Ki-hyeon could pick up on her emotions that fast. Hearing this, Do-young felt slightly flustered with a sweaty face. She silently confessed to herself that she only noticed because she was always watching Ki-hyeon. The image of Ki-hyeon closing in menacingly along with his cold question of who she thought she was flashed back once again, making Do-young's heart clench. Do-young sincerely advised Ji-yeon that if it was too hard to talk about, she should just be honest with her and she wouldn't force it. In response to that warm concern, Ji-yeon suddenly burst into a radiant laugh, melting away all the tension enveloping the two girls. She looked straight into Do-young's eyes and jokingly asked if Do-young was really that into her, making the friendship between them even tighter. Ji-yeon smiled and remarked that Do-young cared about her a lot, causing the black-haired girl to slightly bow her head, secretly thinking she probably didn't care about her friend as much as Ki-hyeon did. Gentle sunlight covered Ji-yeon's beautiful face. Her amber eyes faintly sparkled with tenderness and trust. Sitting quietly together on the stone bench, Ji-yeon unexpectedly confessed that she actually really needed someone to share with to relieve her mind. She shared her desire to have a friend she could comfortably confide in without feeling pressured, then hesitantly brought up the matter with Kwon-tae from yesterday. The atmosphere suddenly turned somber as Ji-yeon began to recount the details that made her feel insecure and extremely awkward. Anxiety was evident on every feature of her face. The girl seemed to be enduring a heavy secret without knowing where to start fixing it. Ji-yeon jumped up in a panic and urgently asked about Do-young's safety, but her friend only softly replied that she firmly believed Tae wouldn't actually hurt her. Ji-yeon placed a hand on her forehead in deep distress, constantly tossing and turning internally to find a way to completely escape the harasser's stalking. Seeing her friend in pain, Do-young clearly showed her anxiety and hesitantly suggested whether they should tell Ki-hyeon about this. At that suggestion, Ji-yeon stayed silent and gazed into the distance with sorrowful eyes, seemingly still torn over the tough decisions ahead. Ji-yeon startled and stood right up, loudly shooting down Do-young's suggestion, which left her friend bewildered and asking again. She zoned out for a moment with a look of pure confusion, as if she was going through a fierce mental struggle over an unspeakable secret. Suddenly, she flashed a bright smile, telling herself that she couldn't keep refusing forever without giving her friend a valid reason. Ji-yeon started to lead the conversation by mentioning the intense, conflicting relationship between Ki-hyeon and Kwon-tae that everyone recognized. Her eyes suddenly filled with sadness as she confessed that she had felt incredibly disappointed in her best friend Ki-hyeon in the past. Horrifying memories flooded back with the image of a middle school Ki-hyeon standing completely still with dark red bloodstains smeared on his shirt. He stared straight at the opponent with hauntingly cold, sharp purple eyes, recalling a dark event that occurred between them that year. Ji-yeon silently reminisced about how she used to carry an obsession with proactively approaching and befriending everyone around her. She admitted that caring for loners or those cast out of the group had long become a hard habit to break for her. Do-young listened quietly with a heavy heart, silently questioning if the bond between her and Ki-hyeon had also started out of such pity. Ji-yeon reminisced about the first time she met Kwon-tae in her first year of middle school, when he had a strangely quiet and taciturn demeanor. Looking at the lonely figure with his head down on the desk, she couldn't help but feel compassion and wanted to break the silence enveloping the poor boy. Even though Tae initially always showed a grumpy and unapproachable attitude, Ji-yeon persistently did not give up and continuously took the initiative to start conversations. Her gaze was tinged with sadness as she realized that cold personality brought back so many memories of the first time she met Ki-hyeon. She persistently showed kindness, always being the one to approach and find ways to break the solid shell Tae had built around himself. Eventually, her sincerity paid off as Tae gradually opened up, revealing a blushing, shy face in response to her care. However, Ji-yeon's expression suddenly fell when mentioning the terrifying change that began to spark within him since then. Tae started using violence to attack classmates and casually smirked, treating those brutal acts as just a fun joke. He even brazenly held up his phone displaying a sensitive image, mocking that the girl in it looked exactly like the other person. Despite being criticized for being disgusting, Tae still smiled triumphantly and asked back why they were getting angry over a compliment. Ji-yeon silently remarked that Kwon Tae-oh was a person who knew no bounds when he casually looked at his phone and threw sarcastic remarks at girls these days. He started falling into bad habits, openly smoking with his gang under the delusion that it made him look cool. Not stopping there, Tae-oh arrogantly sat on his desk and acted like a bully just to show off his recklessness. With limited tolerance, the class started to break out into heated arguments, wondering why Ji-yeon still blindly protected someone like that. Eventually, all the classmates turned their backs in unison, turning Tae-oh into someone completely isolated in the suffocating classroom space. Witnessing her friend's dazed eyes and devastated expression, Ji-yeon once again fell into a vortex of guilt and compassion. She stood by the lockers and humbled herself to persuade everyone, using all her sincere words to beg for Tae-oh to have a chance to reintegrate. Looking at her determination, Ki-hyeon and the other friends reluctantly agreed out of respect for Ji-yeon's opinion. She joyfully said her thanks, completely unaware that behind the door, Tae-oh was stealthily watching her every move. He let out a mysterious smirk, showing that the whole situation seemed to be within this sly fox's calculations. Ji-yeon smiled, giving her thanks, and silently concluded that things between them lately were going extremely smoothly and favorably. However, Tae-oh suddenly paused with a highly suspicious look. It seemed he was silently putting a huge question mark on his friend's attitude. Meanwhile, Ki-hyeon stood silently in the back with sharp, cold purple eyes and an authoritative demeanor, as if he were controlling the whole situation. Tae-oh clearly showed a gloomy, murderous expression. He narrowed his eyes in annoyance and asked himself what on earth the other was trying to say. Ji-yeon stood in the middle of the storm of tension. She tried to mediate their relationship, but realized the atmosphere between the two boys was fiercely exploding. Ki-hyeon stared thoughtfully into the distance, bitterly admitting that he couldn't possibly control the true emotions of the people around him. The classmates began to whisper and gossip about the close childhood relationship between Ki-hyeon and Ji-yeon, causing old rumors to gradually be dug up again. Tae-oh stood amidst those whispers, gritting his teeth and pressing to know if it was really true that the two of them weren't secretly dating. Looking toward the sunlit school building, a sincere piece of advice echoed out, saying she didn't need to sacrifice so much for someone like him. Ji-yeon bowed her head, full of worries by the iron fence, softly expressing her simple wish that she just wanted everyone to live in harmony. Ki-hyeon softly called Ji-yeon's name when he saw her begin to show discomfort at his excessive attention in the schoolyard. At the same time, Tae-oh strolled away in a terrible mood, his ears ringing with choked sobs echoing from somewhere. He gritted his teeth in anger, his face distorted by the hatred and resentment fiercely surging in his chest. Suddenly, Tae-oh delivered a violent kick straight into the male student curling up on the classroom floor to vent his anger. He overbearingly yelled, asking if the other guy had just intentionally bumped into him, making the victim tremble and insist it was only an accident. The madness reached its peak when Tae-oh screamed in sheer dissatisfaction, swearing and yelling that he couldn't punish the one standing in his way. Witnessing that increasingly brutal behavior, Ji-yeon stood rooted to the spot, her eyes filled with shock at her friend's terrifying deterioration. She rushed over and interrogated Tae-oh on how he could act so heartlessly and beat up a classmate so senselessly. Ji-yeon earnestly pleaded with him to stop causing trouble for everyone, as that would only make his own situation worse. In response to those heartfelt words of advice, Tae-oh merely let out a careless sigh, as if he didn't care about anything at all. Kwon Tae-oh gave a slight smirk to confirm that what she said was right. A smile full of hidden meaning clearly showed on his freckled face. He set a condition, demanding Ji-yeon fulfill a request of his. In return, he promised to start behaving decently just as she had always hoped. Rumors began to spread fast like wildfire across the hallways. Whispers and gossip about a shocking truth echoed incessantly. A male student loudly announced that Kim Ji-yeon and the rebel Kwon Tae-oh had officially become a couple, leaving Ki-hyeon sitting in stunned silence. Ki-hyeon's eyes suddenly grew terrifyingly gloomy and cold. He silently placed a huge question mark on the reason behind this crazy choice. The whole school sank into shock seeing Tae-oh casually holding Ji-yeon's hand and walking openly, shutting down all speculations about her relationship with Ki-hyeon. Looking deep into Ji-yeon's melancholy eyes, many started to worry and question whether she was being threatened or in any danger. The classmates kept gossiping that this was absurd. They wondered why a perfect girl like her would get involved with such a terrible guy. They concluded that even knowing Taeho's true nature was no better than trash, Ji-yeon still seemed to accept being with him to reform him. The atmosphere became suffocating against Ki-hyeon's silence, as everyone began to believe that Ji-yeon had actually fallen in love with the guy everyone feared. Ki-hyeon gritted his teeth and clenched his fists on the desk when he heard the sarcastic remarks about Ji-yeon's bizarre taste in lovers. He sat alone under the fading sunset, patiently waiting as every phone ring stretched out in vain. The moment someone picked up, Ki-hyeon immediately snapped, interrogating why the other person dared to ignore his calls all day. In a hidden corner of his memory, Ki-hyeon pressed Ji-yeon for the reason she changed, because he was certain she never liked a guy like Taeho at all. Facing his cold and pressure-filled face, Ji-yeon could only bow her head wearily and drop words of acceptance to the harsh reality. Taeho brazenly held out his phone as a threat, coldly declaring that it was time for everything to be completely finished. Ki-hyeon's eyes suddenly became hauntingly sharp and cold as he snarled, asserting that he would soon find the location where they were sneaking around together. Do-young shockingly swallowed hard in absolute fear. She clearly felt the wrath about to explode from the boy across from her. Returning to reality on the stone bench, Do-young anxiously looked at Jaeon, then hesitantly asked about what happened next after that horrific event that year. Jaeon looked sorrowfully into the distance, silently asking herself whether she was regretting telling this whole painful truth. Ki-hyeon, with patchy bloodstains on his shirt's chest, dropped his head in exhaustion in the dark as if he had just been through a grueling battle. His purple eyes suddenly glowed hauntingly when he looked up with a completely out-of-control expression, his trembling hands covering the blood on the corner of his mouth. Amidst the suffocating space, Jaeon appeared from afar and screamed Seo Ki-hyeon's name in utter shock. She tearfully questioned why someone like him could have the heart to beat a person so brutally like this. Jaeon painfully expressed her overwhelming disappointment at witnessing such a horrific scene from the very person she had fully trusted. Standing in front of her best friend, she silently thought that perhaps in his eyes, her ideals of living were truly ridiculous. Burying her head into Ki-hyeon's chest, Jaeon choked up, recounting that she was the daughter of heroes, so she always longed to live up to her parents' expectations. Memories rushed back with the image of a little girl hugging her teddy bear tight, engraving her father's words to never turn her back when seeing friends in trouble. Her parents, in their radiant rescue uniforms, hoped their daughter would soon grow up to be as good and brave as they were. Jaeon gave a bitter smile, realizing those were their exact last words, turning her kindness into an unshakable, lifelong burden. The memory of the blazing fire brought back the profound teachings Jaeon had once heard from her own parents. She sobbed, expressing that she understood loneliness better than anyone and couldn't bear to just stand and watch things unfold. The little girl miserably blamed herself for letting Taeho cause trouble for the whole class and swore that she would have to step up and fix it. Jaeon hugged Ki-hyeon tightly, who bore wounds on his face, asserting that only she could stop Taeho's madness. Facing that determination, Ki-hyeon softly voiced his confirmation that he had now truly understood her heart. He coldly concluded she had no other choice left, and Jaeon could only nod in bitter admission. Tears of frustration still poured out as the little girl tried to choke out the words about what happened next. Ki-hyeon smirked with a hidden meaning, despite his face still patched with blood, declaring that he would start helping her from right now. That was the turning point moment that caused Seo Ki-hyeon's character and personality to completely change forever after. He stood silently in front of the teacher in the office to sincerely confess and admit to all his violent acts against Taeho. Jaeon stood in the middle of the school hallway with a face full of worries, silently thinking that what bothered her the most was the fact that Ki-hyeon was suddenly revered as a hero. The female students surrounded Ki-hyeon with endless praises. They gleefully told each other about his feat of breaking the evil Taos nose to teach him a lesson. Jaeon quietly watched that change with sad eyes. She realized the ironic truth when violence was suddenly glorified as an act of justice. In her mind, the image of Ki-hyeon returned with a rare, gentle smile, a warm expression that he originally reserved only for her whenever the two were together. Amidst the surrounding crowd, Ki-hyeon suddenly turned his head, called out Jaeon's name, and asked her to quickly come closer to him. Whispers started clinging to Ji-yeon's every step as they whispered to each other that she was forced to date Tae-oh and only agreed out of pity for everyone. Ki-hyeon casually and firmly asserted that from now on, Ji-yeon would never have to worry about the harassment of that trash Tae-oh ever again. Standing lonely on the empty road, Ji-yeon bitterly realized that her friend's admiration had now completely shifted to Ki-hyeon, leaving her swallowed up in the shadows. She bitterly admitted she had been completely replaced as she witnessed Ki-hyeon radiantly walking in the embrace of his new friends. Under the faint sunlight, Ji-yeon forced a very strained smile and secretly regretted it, not knowing whether telling the truth right now was a mistake or not. Ji-yeon, sitting on the stone bench, softly confessed to Do-young about her naivety in the past when she accidentally made her kindness become a weapon that hurt others. She revealed an uneasy look and feared that history would repeat itself, causing Ki-hyeon to once again fall into an out-of-control state like during those middle school years. With a forced, bitterly sour smile, Ji-yeon painfully confirmed that all the sins stemmed from her own wrong choices. Do-young quietly bowed her head to listen, feeling inevitably shocked inside at the secrets of Ki-hyeon's scarred past that she had never known about. Looking at the faint sunbeams piercing through the canopy, the little girl silently questioned whether Ki-hyeon was truly an innocent pawn in this calculating game. The image of Ki-hyeon with sad eyes appeared like a slow-motion film, urging her to find answers for the upcoming events. Do-young swallowed hard nervously, silently deducing that Ki-hyeon's wrath would explode fiercely if he found out the whole truth being hidden. Amidst the quiet schoolyard, Ki-hyeon stood with folded arms leaning against the wall with a cold demeanor, seemingly quietly observing every move from afar. Do-young felt a bit restless with a sweaty face. Her mind constantly flashed with the worst-case scenarios regarding that boy's reaction. Ji-yeon sat quietly on the bench, her face heavy with regret as she admitted that her past naivety and good intentions had actually unintentionally hurt others. Her trembling eyes looked at Do-young, confessing her fear that history was repeating itself and that she herself would cause Ki-hyeon to fall into a deep, dark abyss once again, just like years ago. Forcing a bitter, strained smile, Ji-yeon scratched her head and left her sentence hanging, as if she were at a dead end trying to find a way out of her past mistakes. Witnessing her friend's pain, Do-young summoned all her courage to assert that Ji-yeon had done nothing wrong and that the past tragedies were inherently just unintended accidents. The young girl bowed her head determinedly, her eyes sincere as she reassured Ji-yeon that in reality, there were still people saved by that kindness, and they would be grateful to her for the rest of their lives. Ji-yeon listened in stunned silence as Do-young used herself as an example, describing herself as a sullen, clumsy person who always carried a gloomy aura that frightened everyone around her. But just as she confessed how grateful she was to be accepted for who she truly was by Ji-yeon, Do-young suddenly froze, panicking internally and wondering if she was saying things that were way too weird. Embarrassment washed over Do-young's pale face, and she secretly feared that Ji-yeon would start finding her annoying and eccentric after that confession. Contrary to those worries, Ji-yeon looked up with deeply moved, glistening eyes, softly admitting that those were exactly the words of comfort she had been longing to hear the most. As if infused with newfound energy, Ji-yeon suddenly sprang up from the bench and cheered in gratitude to Do-young, leaving the shy girl completely frozen by her friend's sudden change in demeanor. Ji-yeon flashed a radiant smile with sparkling eyes, cheerfully declaring that the two of them could be friends for a long time, or even best friends for life. That sincerity left Do-young stunned for a moment, before she softly confessed that those were exactly the words she herself was longing to hear most at this very moment. To dispel the tense atmosphere, Ji-yeon confidently raised both hands, smiling brightly as she said she just wanted to lift the burden off her chest, advising Do-young not to worry because she would handle everything on her own. But Do-young's face still bore clear signs of anxiety. She reached out as if to hold her friend back, her mind relentlessly wondering what Ji-yeon planned to do with Kwon Tae-oh and whether she could actually be of any help. Before she could find an answer, Ki-hyeon's tall figure loomed from behind, coldly reminding them both to head back since class was about to start, causing Do-young to jump in startled agreement. On the way back, cold sweat rolled down Do-young's forehead, her mind completely consumed by fear as she secretly wondered if someone as calculated and profound as Ki-hyeon would truly let this matter slide. That anxiety quickly became reality when Ki-hyeon suddenly blocked her path, standing tall with crossed arms as his piercing, deep violet eyes radiated a heavy pressure directed straight at her. Do-young's body trembled slightly, sweat drenching both sides of her temples as she cowered, utterly bewildered as to why he suddenly demanded to meet her privately in such a deserted place. Not giving her a chance to escape, Ki-hyeon suddenly leaned his face down, getting suffocatingly close, and growled directly at her with an overbearing attitude. Cornered, the young girl swallowed hard in fear, her wide black eyes filled with panic as she stammered, asking what exactly he was planning to do with her. Ki-hyeon suddenly interrogated Do-young about the private conversation between her and Ji-yeon, leaving the young girl completely frozen in shock. The young man maintained his ice-cold expression, his sharp violet eyes drilling deep into her to demand an honest answer. He silently leaned back against the stone wall, standing tall with crossed arms like a judging deity, yet radiating an incredibly overbearing pressure. At times, Ki-hyeon would slightly knit his brows in deep thought, secretly calculating his next moves in this highly tense psychological game. Recalling the moment he observed them from afar, he secretly felt annoyed that the great distance had prevented him from clearly hearing the secrets they exchanged. As for Do-young, she could only bow her head to avoid him, stammering to find a way to speak under the intense interrogation from her deep, calculating seatmate. Panic was clearly visible on her pale face. Do-young broke into a cold sweat as she realized she was being cornered with absolutely no way out. Ki-hyeon remained motionless under the setting sun, silently observing every single flaw in her expression with a gaze as sharp as a razor. A faint sadness showed clearly in Do-young's eyes. She painfully lowered her eyelashes as she felt her heart being suffocated by the terrifying silence. Finally, the young girl tightly closed her eyes in resignation, summoning the last of her strength to prepare to expose the entire truth she had been trying to hide. Summoning all her courage under the overbearing pressure, Do-young looked up slightly and honestly confessed that she was just incredibly worried about leaving Ji-yeon alone. Hearing that reason, Ki-hyeon's cold expression suddenly froze, his violet eyes momentarily flashing with a glint of surprise as if he hadn't anticipated such sincerity from her. However, he quickly regained his usual composure, slightly casting his eyes down and coldly declaring that in the end, everything was still unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. That profound, calculating attitude made Do-young jump in fright. She was secretly terrified to realize that the feelings Ki-hyeon harbored for his childhood friend were by no means as simple as they appeared on the surface. Looking at the quiet profile of the young man before her, she shuddered, realizing that this obsession was far heavier, deeper, and more intense than what people usually called love. Do-young's train of thought was abruptly interrupted when Ki-hyeon suddenly whipped around, reached out to grab her sleeve tightly, and decisively dragged her along in a completely overbearing manner. The pull was so strong that it sent the young girl stumbling. She hurriedly grabbed his hem to salvage some balance and frantically shouted for him to stop immediately. Do-young's face was drenched in sweat, her eyes wide with panic as she loudly questioned what on earth he thought he was doing in a situation like this. In response to her fear, Ki-hyeon glared back with raging bloodlust, gritting his teeth and growling that who knows what kind of depraved things that bastard Kwon-tae was doing to Jeon right this second. His erupted fury mixed with ultimate resentment. He growled in self-blame for being completely oblivious, while furiously resenting the fact that Ji-yeon should have confided that awful matter to him instead of her. Do-young slightly lowered her eyes, explaining that Ji-yeon hid everything simply out of fear that Ki-hyeon would lose his mind and go crazy again, just like the brawl years ago. As she stammered that Ji-yeon only told her to prepare for the worst-case scenario, Ki-hyeon immediately whipped around, snapping and criticizing her for rambling so annoyingly. He turned back to press close, coldly exposing that Do-young was actually just afraid of getting a bad reputation herself rather than worrying about her friend's safety. Hit right where it hurt, Do-young gasped and snapped her head up, frantically denying the sharp accusation from the young man before her. Clutching her collar tightly in immense tension, she broke into a cold sweat, her mind frantically working to find a reason powerful enough to stop him. Summoning all her courage, Do-young pleaded that because he was so important, Ji-yeon had to grit her teeth and endure it, and begged him to try looking at things from her friend's perspective. Ki-hyeon's gaze wavered slightly, those words instantly pulling him deep into the perspective of a Kim Ji-yeon who always lived and died by her ideals of justice. Memories rushed back of the young girl standing behind her parents, a person who always forced herself to blindly carry the weight of righteousness. He bitterly realized that if anyone were to get hurt because of him, Ji-yeon would only torment herself with guilt and permanently push him out of her life. Standing silently under the evening glow, Ki-hyeon thoughtfully admitted a heartbreaking truth. Ever since that violent incident, Ji-yeon had completely stopped sharing her fears with him. Ki-hyeon bitterly admitted that he was extremely annoyed when Ji-yeon chose to confide everything to a stranger, like Do-young, instead of him. Nevertheless, he tried to suppress his anger, sighing softly as he accepted reality and admitted that he had been too hot-headed just now. He coldly declared that he would personally handle the rebellious Teo smoothly, so that neither she nor Ji-yeon would ever have to worry about hearing his name again. Do-young shuddered in terror at his violent decision, secretly fearing that Ki-hyeon was actually more impulsive and frightening than she had thought. The next day passed under a quiet atmosphere engulfing the school corridors. There was absolutely no further news or disruption since that tense conversation. Do-young walked listlessly, doubts constantly rising in her heart as to whether Ki-hyeon had truly cleaned up the trouble smoothly. Just then, she startled and stopped in her tracks when she saw the familiar figure of Teo leaning against the staff room door looking completely unusual. Suddenly, the rebellious guy whipped his head around, revealing a battered face and a murderous glare directed straight at her. Witnessing those vivid traces of violence, Do-young was terrified and quickly covered her mouth with her hands to stop herself from screaming in horror. Seeing Do-young trying to avoid him, Teo abruptly called her back in a highly suspicious tone. Being called back unexpectedly, Do-young turned around in fear and asked what he wanted, while Teo demanded to know if Ji-yeon had revealed anything to her. Trying to suppress her panic, she pretended not to know and asked back, causing Teo to stare suspiciously at her sweat-drenched face. Realizing her clueless expression, he clicked his tongue, let it go, and muttered that if she hadn't said anything, then that was good. Right after that, he coldly announced that he was about to drop out of school and asked her to pass the message to Ji-yeon, leaving Do-young completely frozen in astonishment. Watching Teo's back as he decisively walked away, she wanted to call him back, but her throat was tight, unable to make a sound. In Do-young's mind, Ki-hyeon's cold promise to personally clean up this rebellious guy in the smoothest way immediately echoed. She was stunned and raised the question of whether Teo's battered face and sudden decision to drop out were all orchestrated by Ki-hyeon's hands. Stepping closer to the window in shock, Do-young looked down and caught sight of Ki-hyeon's lonely figure standing quietly in the middle of the empty schoolyard. Her face was heavy with thought under the afternoon sunlight, trembling as she accepted the truth about a violent and scheme-filled love that the boy was practicing to protect Ji-yeon. While shockingly gazing at the schoolyard, Do-young jumped in fright when Ki-hyeon suddenly pressed closely right behind her back. He softly leaned into her ear to ask if that rebellious guy had left yet, causing the small girl to turn around abruptly in high alert. Responding to that confusion was a radiant yet chilling smile from Ki-hyeon as he gently called her name. Looking at his unusually bright expression, Do-young stuttered a comment that he seemed to be in extremely high spirits today. In response, Ki-hyeon proactively asked if Ji-yeon had received any news from that guy recently, then confidently asserted that it would never happen upon hearing her say she wasn't sure. Revealing the reason was because he was holding Teo's phone. He shocked Do-young as she realized the phone had been smashed to pieces. Afterward, he playfully inquired if she was truly curious about the method he used to handle that rebellious guy smoothly. Looking at the smashed evidence in his hand, she could only tremble and stutter in agreement while Ki-hyeon quietly cast his eyes down to observe his trophy. Revealing the reason was because he was holding Teo's phone. He shocked Do-young as she realized the phone had been smashed to pieces. Horrific memories rushed back of the scene where Teo screamed threats to tell Ji-yeon to ruin him, but Ki-hyeon only contemptuously challenged him to go ahead and mocked that it was the only backing giving him the nerve to make trouble. Ki-hyeon gripped Teo's collar tightly, coldly warning that the guy was completely powerless under his hands. He sarcastically pointed out that there was not even a scratch on his body as evidence, and who would believe a thug's words over the exemplary image he painstakingly built. Not stopping there, Ki-hyeon's eyes flashed with a sharp coldness as he prepared to play his final trump card to crush his opponent. He exposed that he had seen all the sick things in his phone, and contemptuously asked what right Teo had to continue acting stubborn. Teo swallowed hard in fear when he heard him issue an ultimatum to obediently hand over the device and get lost in silence if he didn't want Ji-yeon to find out. With no way out, the thug could only humiliatingly throw the broken phone to the ground and quietly turn his back to retreat. Returning to reality, Ki-hyeon thoughtfully pondered that people like Teo might be unreasonable but were extremely afraid of having their reputation ruined, which was what she and Ji-yeon had been worried about for days. Looking at his calm expression at this moment, Do-young breathed a sigh of relief, secretly feeling lucky that she ultimately decided to trust and share with Ki-hyeon. Suddenly, he turned to sincerely thank her, admitting that everything being resolved smoothly was thanks to Do-young informing him in advance. Ki-hyeon's face relaxed into a warm smile, gently sending a message that from now on he would have to completely rely on her. Standing frozen in place, Do-young was stunned and dazed by the unexpected message from him. Watching Ki-hyeon's back gradually disappear around the corner of the corridor, she confusedly wondered if she had truly just been officially acknowledged by him. But immediately, Do-young vigorously shook her head, secretly warning herself absolutely not to be delusional about her own importance or get complacent ever again. Dark memories of the days of torment suddenly rushed back, suffocating her mind with a vague fear. The image of a cold, distant Ki-hyeon appeared as a cruel reminder that she was originally just a thorn in his side. Returning to reality with sorrowful eyes, Do-young bitterly told herself that from now on she must definitely know her own limits and clearly know where her position belonged. Time quickly passed. A solemn atmosphere filled the classroom as the group presentation officially began. On the podium, Ji-yeon confidently wore a radiant smile, clearly announcing the conclusion of Group 6's presentation. Loud rounds of applause simultaneously erupted across the classroom in enthusiastic praise from the whole class for the entire group. As soon as the assignment was finished, Ji-yeon could not hide her excitement, joyfully stretching and cheering because all the troubles and pressures were finally resolved. The presentation had just concluded when Ji-yeon happily turned to praise Do-young, making her blush and return the compliment. Riding on this wave of success, Ji-yeon excitedly invited Do-young to hang out to celebrate the completion of their group assignment, leaving the small girl utterly stunned. Do-young nervously glanced over at Ki-hyeon, recalling his previous warning to stay away from Jeon. Unexpectedly, Ki-hyeon lowered his eyes and spoke up, thoughtfully interrupting the two girls. He made the excuse that his dad would worry if he came home late and suggested the two of them just go ahead and have fun, causing Jeon to ask him again in surprise. Despite Ji-yeon repeatedly insisting and expressing regret because she genuinely wanted Do-young to join them, Ki-hyeon just quietly rested his chin on his hand and observed. Seeing this, Do-young gently looked up and advised him to try asking his family for permission. Faced with her innocence, Ki-hyeon suddenly tilted his head and smiled cryptically, asserting that the fun would be somewhat less interesting without her presence. His sweet words and gentle plea instantly turned Do-young to stone, her panicked mind reminding herself absolutely not to be delusional. But looking at Ki-hyeon's handsome, radiantly smiling face right now, she was completely confused, unable to understand what on earth this sudden change in his attitude meant. Standing in front of the closet with clothes scattered all over the floor, Do-young busily tried on outfits to prepare for her first hangout. Trying a dark cardigan on, the small girl anxiously wondered if this simple outfit was really okay. She was worried that her appearance looked too plain, especially since this was her first time going out alone with a friend on a weekend. Do-young told herself that if she dressed up too much, she would look like she was overly excited, just as her dad slightly pushed the door open and walked in to call her. Seeing his daughter taking unusual care of her appearance, the dad immediately panicked and questioned whether she was getting ready to meet a boy, making her startle and deny it. Do-young embarrassedly stammered, secretly flustered as she admitted to herself that the other person was indeed a boy, but things hadn't reached that level yet. Glancing at her phone screen, the small girl jumped in panic when she realized the meeting time was already approaching. Without hesitating for another second, Do-young hurriedly dashed out the door, only having enough time to yell goodbye to her dad and ask him to clean her room, leaving the dad helplessly calling after her. His precious daughter's lightning-fast departure made the dad cry tears of self-pity, while her younger brother standing nearby could only scratch his head in bewilderment, not understanding what was going on. Watching his older sister's rushed figure, the younger brother curiously asked his mom where she was going so suddenly, and the mother smiled, noting that Do-young seemed much happier since entering high school. Do-young waited nervously at the meeting spot at the foot of a building, her heart beating non-stop with anxiety. While restlessly worrying, she gave a slight start when she suddenly heard someone loudly calling her name from afar. It turned out to be Ji-yeon and Ki-hyeon walking over together, and her friend cheerfully asked why she had arrived so early when there were still 10 whole minutes left. Do-young unconsciously held her breath, completely frozen by Ki-hyeon's captivating handsomeness, as it was her first time seeing him in casual streetwear. She still couldn't believe she was actually having a real-life hangout with him, just as John eagerly asked where she wanted to go today. That enthusiasm made Do-young flustered, and she hurriedly waved her hands, saying she was fine with going anywhere. She shyly apologized for not knowing what people her age usually did for fun, but Ji-yeon brushed it off and excitedly declared that she had already planned a detailed itinerary for all 3 of them. And so, the group officially blended into the dense crowd on the bustling street under the beautiful weekend weather. Ji-yeon intimately linked arms with Do-young to lead the way, while Ki-hyeon leisurely strolled parallel right next to the 2 girls. Upon stopping at a fashion store, Ji-yeon excitedly tried on a fancy dress, making Do-young delightfully give a thumbs up in approval while he quietly stood observing from behind. The next destination on the trip was a bustling arcade that Ji-yeon had pre-scheduled. The 3 of them joined a basketball shooting game, Ji-yeon and Ki-hyeon happily laughing and joking around while Do-young watched them in happiness. Right after that, Ji-yeon excitedly pointed toward a zombie shooter arcade machine and pulled Do-young closer. Do-young and Ki-hyeon both held guns to experience the thrilling game under the enthusiastic cheering of her best friend. After exhausting moments of playing, they stopped by a fancy restaurant together with a dining table fully laid out with appetizing dishes. Ji-yeon excitedly used her phone to take a picture of the lavish feast to preserve the memorable moment of the 3. A moment later, Do-young quietly picked up her phone, intently observing the screen with thoughtful eyes. On the screen was a close-up photo of the delicious-looking dishes they had just shared together. But the point that caught her attention the most was the moment Ki-hyeon's hands accidentally made it into the frame while picking up food. Gazing at that small yet priceless moment, a feeling of warmth and indescribably sweet happiness suddenly swelled up in Do-young's heart. At the restaurant, Ji-yeon happily posed for a photo with a dining table, while Ki-hyeon sat beside her, smiling gently as he looked at her. He gently reached out to tease his best friend, his expression radiant and overflowing with a doting affection reserved only for her. Do-young looked at the photo on her phone, unable to hide a glowing, happy smile at this tiny memory. The photo had captured the moment all 3 hands playfully posed next to the plate of food, a testament to a friendship that was gradually blossoming. On the way, Do-young hugged her phone tightly while smiling, her heart filled with an unprecedented sweet and warm feeling. Her train of thought was suddenly interrupted when she heard Ji-yeon loudly call her name from up ahead. Her best friend was excitedly pointing at a souvenir shop, asking the whole group to stop by because there were many cute items. As soon as they walked inside, Ji-yeon excitedly suggested buying matching keychains, making Ki-hyeon curiously ask which type she wanted to choose. She happily held up a pretty pink bear keychain and spared no praise for its adorableness. Ki-hyeon immediately offered gently to buy it as a gift for his best friend, while Do-young stood dejectedly in a corner, her hand tightly gripping a heart-shaped keychain with envy and self-pity surging in her heart. Drowning in self-pity, Do-young was startled when Ki-hyeon suddenly turned to ask her what she was doing in that corner. He gently told her to bring the keychain she was choosing closer, causing Ji-yeon beside them to ask again in surprise. Ki-hyeon proactively suggested that all 3 of them use a matching group keychain set, leaving Do-young stunned as she told herself not to hope for too much. Looking at his gentle smile, she wondered in confusion why he was suddenly being so nice to her and whether it was only because of Ji-yeon's presence there. But she immediately recalled the moment the 2 of them were alone in the gym, when his gentle expression back then didn't seem to be fate. Nevertheless, she forced herself to wake up from the dream, reminding herself of her promise to absolutely never come between the two of them. In her insecurity, Do-young thought that a timid and pathetic person like herself was ultimately just a troublesome existence, standing in the way of his happiness. Yet, amid the darkness of that insecurity, a faint glimmer of hope suddenly flashed in the small girl's mind. Looking at the matching keychain resting in the palm of her hand, she wavered slightly and wondered if she had the right to harbor hope. Cherishing the bright red heart symbol in her hand, Do-young blushed in embarrassment, harboring a tiny wish of whether she could truly become his friend. While they were strolling along the street together, the atmosphere was suddenly shattered by a phone ringing repeatedly. Ki-hyeon quietly pulled out his phone to check it, his face instantly hardening into a cold, soulless expression. Seeing his strange attitude, Ji-yeon walked beside him and curiously asked what was wrong and who was calling. He coldly replied that it was his dad, and there was no need to answer, startling Do-young behind him at the mention of that man. In her mind, memories immediately surfaced of the famous actor Seo Kang-suk, the notorious father in his family tragedy. The phone in Ki-hyeon's hand continued to vibrate violently, plunging all three of them into a suffocating silence. Unable to leave it be, Ji-yeon advised him that this might be an emergency call and that he should probably answer it. Ki-hyeon sighed helplessly, asking the two girls to wait for him for a moment, even though they knew full well he didn't want to pick up. He quietly walked to a remote, secluded corner to prepare to face the high-pressure call. The moment the call connected, Ki-hyeon immediately received a blunt and cold command from his father, forcing him to go buy alcohol for him. On the other end of the line, his father violently insulted him with the worst words, demanding to know where he was loitering. Wearily, Ki-hyeon reminded him that he was still a minor, but his father coldly brushed it off, using the excuse that he had bought alcohol many times before. Threatened that everything in the house would be smashed to pieces if he didn't bring the alcohol back immediately, Ki-hyeon lowered his eyes, only able to sigh helplessly in bitterness. Returning to reality, he turned back to tell them both that he had to go home urgently, just as Jeon also had to go back to prepare dinner for her grandmother. As they were about to say goodbye to head their separate ways, Ki-hyeon suddenly called out to stop Do-young. He gently requested that she walk with Ji-yeon to ensure she got home safely, because he had an urgent matter to handle. Worried about her friend's safety after the trouble with Teo, Do-young immediately agreed to see her friend home, causing Ki-hyeon to thank her in relief. Along the way, Ji-yeon walked closely beside her new friend, curiously asking if she lived near this area. Do-young embarrassedly lied that she was just on her way to buy some things nearby, and Ji-yeon cheerfully accepted the reason. Suddenly, Ji-yeon smiled knowingly and remarked that Ki-hyeon seemed to genuinely like her, making Do-young panic, widen her eyes, and stutter a denial. Ji-yeon sincerely asserted that she wasn't joking at all, as she had been best friends with Ki-hyeon for a very long time. She revealed a shocking truth that she had never seen Ki-hyeon treat anyone else with such kindness or special gentleness besides her. Despite Do-young shyly arguing that he was naturally kind to everyone, Ji-yeon thoughtfully admitted that she might have phrased it a bit wrong. She gently shook her keychain while explaining that what she meant was, when it came to treating someone like family and truly opening up, Do-young was the first person to achieve that. Ji-yeon emphasized that such small acts of care were things Ki-hyeon had previously done only for her, with absolutely no precedent for anyone else. Her best friend's firm assertion left Do-young completely flustered, a hard-to-describe fluttering feeling subtly rising in her heart. She told herself that Ji-yeon was definitely the person who understood him best, just as a motorcycle came speeding up dangerously from behind. The roar of the engine right next to her startled Do-young in a panic, leaving her completely disoriented by the sudden situation. Detecting the imminent danger, Ji-yeon screamed a warning for her friend to quickly get out of the way. In a split second of life and death, Ji-yeon did not hesitate to lunge straight forward, tightly hugging Do-young and pulling her hard away from the vehicle's fatal impact. Ji-yeon held Do-young tightly in a protective embrace, shielding her from the near-miss collision. After a sharp swerve, the motorcycle lost control, crashed, and slid across the cold concrete road surface. Do-young sat on the ground in shock, her trembling voice repeatedly calling Jaeon's name in utter terror. Her tears poured down as she witnessed the horrific scene before her eyes, her inner self screaming prayers for her friend's safety. The sunset sky gradually fell, dyeing the corner of the street a brilliant red like an omen for a catastrophic tragedy that had just struck. Meanwhile, Ki-hyeon wearily carried the bag of alcohol back, sighing in frustration because he had to walk a very long distance just to find a place that didn't check IDs. While completely immersed in complex and confusing thoughts about Doyoung, the phone in his hand suddenly vibrated, interrupting his train of thought. Looking down at the screen, Ki-hyeon was extremely surprised to see the incoming call displaying Chai Doyoung's name. He quickly answered the call in puzzlement, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. In just an instant, Ki-hyeon's eyes suddenly widened in horror as the panicked sounds from the other end echoed back, shattering his last bit of composure. Receiving the terrible news over the phone, the bag of alcohol in Ki-hyeon's hand dropped to the ground, shattering completely just like his mood at that moment. He uttered a question in hopeless shock, his purple eyes filled with bewilderment at the horrific information about Ji-yeon's accident. The hospital scene appeared under a sorrowful evening sky, where a battle to reclaim the poor girl's life was taking place. Doyoung stood lonely in front of the hospital lobby, her tiny figure enveloped by an unceasing sense of guilt and regret. The small girl bit her nails in extreme anxiety, sweat breaking out as she thought about the critical condition of her only friend. Doyoung's eyes trembled with fear when she saw a familiar figure frantically rushing toward her from a distance. Ki-hyeon ran like mad to the meeting spot, his face drenched in sweat and his breath ragged from worrying too much about his loved one's safety. The moment he saw Doyoung, he lost control, rushing forward to grab her shoulders tightly and screaming to demand why she could be so terribly useless. His bursting rage turned into gloomy self-reproach for making such a mistake in entrusting Ji-yeon to someone who couldn't even protect others like her. He gritted his teeth and barked at her for wasting time calling him instead of calling 119 emergency services, leaving Doyoung to only tremble, burst into tears, and utter apologies in despair. Ki-hyeon callously shoved Doyoung aside, coldly snapping at her to get out of the way so he could immediately go see Jeon. Left behind alone in the hallway, Doyoung stood frozen in the darkness, painfully blaming herself for being too afraid. The sunset faded over the distant mountains, signaling that a long day full of heartbreaking events was drawing to a close. Night quickly enveloped the space, returning a terrifying silence to the empty hospital grounds. Doyoung remained standing motionless in the same spot for hours, her tiny figure dwarfed by the cold stone wall. While dazed in hopelessness, she startled slightly and looked up when she heard someone calling her name, breaking the silence. It turned out to be her dad and younger brother who had frantically rushed over to find her. Her dad worried because the family had arrived way too late compared to the scheduled time. He hurriedly checked his daughter all over, anxiously asking if she was injured or if any misfortune had happened to her. Faced with her family's care, Doyoung could only cast her eyes down in deep sorrow, her heart heavy as she thought about her friend's catastrophic accident. Trying to suppress the brokenness inside, the small girl forced a faint smile and softly reassured her dad that she was completely fine. Ji-yeon looked down at the bandaged wound on her knee, gently reassuring him that it was just a minor scratch not worth worrying about. In the hospital room, Ki-hyeon looked haggard as he listened to her complain that Doyoung had panicked too much and called him over, even though she only fainted for a moment. His eyes were full of pain mixed with anger, choking up as he pressed for the cause of the accident and why the one suffering was always her. Ji-yeon slightly turned her face away, revealing the truth that the motorcycle's target at that time was actually heading straight for Doyoung. Ki-hyeon was stunned into silence when she recounted the moment she had panicked and pushed her friend away, only to take the impact herself. He suddenly got angry and yelled, harshly questioning why she always chose to save others without ever thinking about her own safety. His face contorted in agony, asking her if she ever truly understood who was the most worried whenever they saw her injured. Faced with the overwhelming sincerity from her best friend, Ji-yeon could only remain silent, her lips pressed tightly together in resignation. Her eyes suddenly became sharp and determined, emphasizing once again that Doyoung's life was truly in serious danger at that time. Trying to force a smile, she affirmed that her actions had prevented a tragedy and that she was perfectly fine now. Ki-hyeon bowed his head apologetically by Ji-yeon's hospital bed after hearing the whole truth about the accident. He painfully exclaimed that he really didn't know what to say in the face of his best friend's reckless sacrifice. Right at that moment, Hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway along with an anxious call heading toward the emergency room. The door flew open, and Do-young's family rushed in, to the astonishment of the two friends present. The father frantically checked his daughter's condition while Do-young awkwardly spoke up to confirm she was fine. She hesitantly introduced her parents to everyone, and Ki-hyeon also quickly regained his composure to offer a polite greeting. Do-young's father anxiously asked about the group's injuries and received a bright smile from Ji-yeon assuring him that she was okay. The little girl tried to lift her leg and walk around to prove to everyone that she could move perfectly normally on her own. The mother tearfully offered her sincere thanks because Ji-yeon had saved Do-young's life and kindly asked for the girl's name and age. The atmosphere suddenly became awkward as Ki-hyeon stared blankly, looking utterly shocked by these incredibly unexpected developments. Ki-hyeon politely bowed and introduced himself as Do-young's classmate, making the father extremely surprised at the teenager's tall appearance. He thoughtfully remarked that this face looked strangely familiar right as the boy restated that his name was Seo Ki-hyeon. The father shockingly realized something astounding, the bewilderment clear on his face, as if he had just discovered a huge secret. He suddenly shouted out loud in sheer amazement, causing Do-young to frantically demand her father keep calm and lower his voice. He kept yelling in excitement, repeatedly asking if this was the famous Ki-hyeon that the whole family often heard about. The mother, out of sheer embarrassment, intervened to remind her husband to stop making a scene, but he still tried to justify that everyone knew his daughter had liked this boy for a long time. The father began dreaming about the future and pressed to know if this was his future son-in-law, causing Do-young to panic and beg him not to say weird things. The little girl bowed her head in insecurity, painfully affirming that someone like her could never stand beside someone as perfect as Ki-hyeon. The father immediately objected fiercely and loudly declared that Do-young was the most beautiful girl because she inherited all her beauty from her mother. The atmosphere suddenly froze when Ki-hyeon unexpectedly appeared at the room's door, leaving Do-young's father gaping in astonishment. Ki-hyeon pressed to know why Do-young was out in the hallway while Ji-yeon was still inside the hospital room. The father unexpectedly pointed his finger and harshly questioned the relationship between him and his daughter, making Do-young scream in panic. The little girl tried to stop him and begged her father to stop because that action made her extremely embarrassed. Do-young feared that her father's rudeness would make someone like Ki-hyeon feel heavily insulted. Looking at his calm expression, she silently prayed that things wouldn't turn into a chaotic scene right at the hospital. The mother hurriedly intervened to defuse the situation and demanded her husband not humiliate their children. The mother sincerely apologized, explaining that he was just acting like an overly protective father to his daughter. Ki-hyeon gently corrected that they were only classmates and became close because Do-young had been his fan since childhood. With a polite demeanor, he affirmed that he completely understood and didn't mind the family's worries at all. He tactfully explained that Do-young was very lovable and emphasized that Ji-yeon was always present during their outings. Ki-hyeon gently advised Do-young to go home and rest because today's incident had made her too tired, and simultaneously promised to stay and take care of Ji-yeon. The father nodded in agreement and urged his daughter to leave quickly, leaving Do-young with no choice but to awkwardly accept in hesitation. He kindly instructed Ki-hyeon to notify him immediately if he needed any help, and asked again whether Ji-yeon could be discharged from the hospital yet. The father decisively pulled out money and handed it to Ki-hyeon to pay the hospital bills and catch a taxi to take his friend home, despite the confused teenager trying to find a way to refuse. Ki-hyeon softly rubbed his arm with a contemplative look, seemingly immersed in messy thoughts about the unpleasant things that had just happened. The father smiled benevolently, endlessly praising that Ki-hyeon had truly grown into an incredibly outstanding young man. Ki-hyeon bowed his head apologetically, sincerely apologizing for his somewhat rude attitude earlier and asserting that he absolutely meant no harm. Amidst the city's high-rise buildings, an exclamation rang out, remarking that the little boy from years ago had truly become a good person. In the car heading home, the mother pressed for the reason why Do-young kept her reunion with Ki-hyeon a secret, making the little girl sigh, and explain that she knew for sure her parents would overreact. The father awkwardly wondered aloud if he had acted a bit too ridiculously during their first meeting and immediately received a brutally honest nod of confirmation from his daughter. On the way home, The mother sitting in the car smiled softly and secretly rejoiced upon realizing that Ki-hyeon in real life was just as lovable as his image on TV. The car rolled through the city streets as the father boldly declared that he couldn't leave a bad impression on his future son-in-law, causing Do-young to scream in desperate protest. Do-young slightly tilted her head to look out the window with a shy smile, secretly enjoying the sweet emotions that had just kindled after the turbulent encounter. The little girl's eyes sparkled with simple happiness, her heart seemingly skipping a beat at the care that person showed her. However, her expression suddenly fell and became melancholic as her insecurities once again rose to take over her mind. In the hospital lobby, Ji-yeon walked with a limp, the bandage wound on her knee serving as a reminder of the painful recklessness that had just passed. Ki-hyeon stood in silence beside his best friend, the atmosphere between the two now enveloped in a troubled and awkward stillness. He unexpectedly spoke up to offer to escort her all the way home using the taxi fare Do-young's father had given, asserting that he wanted to ensure she was safe. Ji-yeon slightly turned her face away in sadness, decisively rejecting his kindness and stating that she could catch a ride home by herself. She looked straight into Ki-hyeon's purple eyes with a somber expression, hesitantly calling his name as if struggling to speak some heartbreaking truth. Ji-yeon looked straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes and decisively affirmed that she was fine in order to refuse his help. Ki-hyeon let out a gasp of astonishment, his eyes tinged with sadness at the cold rejection from his best friend. He quietly bowed his head to accept reality, softly murmuring his agreement to let her leave even though his heart was still full of turmoil. The taxi quickly rolled away from the hospital gates, leaving Ki-hyeon's solitary figure standing silently in the still night. He stood alone in front of the brightly lit building with a dazed look, seemingly immersed in an indescribable sense of emptiness. His sharp purple eyes suddenly turned dark as Ki-hyeon silently chewed on the pain and loneliness that he couldn't share with anyone. Just as he was trudging away, his phone suddenly vibrated, pulling him out of his chaotic train of thought. He slowly raised the device to check it with a curious look, secretly wondering who would send him a text message at this hour. The screen displayed a message from Chai Do-young, sincerely apologizing for the troubles that occurred earlier. Ki-hyeon stood in silence staring at the light emitting from his phone, his heart seemingly beginning to experience strange fluctuations. Ki-hyeon ran his hand through his hair in frustration as he stood silently under the dim lights of the hospital hallway. He felt his chest tighten painfully the exact moment he read the sincere apology text from Do-young. His sad purple eyes were clearly visible through his fingers as he told himself that everything that happened wasn't really that girl's fault. The image of him yelling at and blaming Do-young came back to him as a form of self-reproach because he knew she wasn't a bad person at all. Ki-hyeon buried his face in his hands in helplessness. Even though his mind understood everything clearly, his heart still couldn't calm down. He asked himself why the presence of that little girl could make his mind so agitated. Whenever he faced Do-young's sorrowful face, a strange, unnameable feeling would quietly rise and take over his soul. The quiet night enveloped the high-rise apartment building, where Ki-hyeon quietly returned to dwell on his own thoughts. He stepped into the empty house looking exhausted, as if the pressures from family and friends were draining all his energy. His heavy bare footsteps moving across the cold floor seemed to reflect the loneliness and exhaustion surrounding the young man. Ki-hyeon had barely arrived home when he was met by his father waiting for him, harshly questioning where he had run off to all this time. Suddenly, he lunged forward, grabbing his neck, and rained down mercilessly violent blows, leaving the young man no choice but to endure the beating in silence. Ki-hyeon looked at his father with a melancholic gaze as he heard him sarcastically remark that he hadn't actually ordered him to do anything at this hour. He wearily brushed back his messy hair, silently concluding that he had already anticipated this terrible scenario would unfold. Whenever he dared to resist or refuse to take the beating, the space of the house would turn into a battlefield with furniture shattered to pieces under his father's madness. He chose to indifferently admit that he had forgotten the order, accepting the pain just in hopes that everything would end very quickly. The father stood tall with his face contorted in anger, constantly hurling insults and calling him a massive idiot. Ki-hyeon quietly stroked his hair in humiliation as he listened to his father scream in regret for giving birth to a son like him. He stood silently in front of the glaring light from the screen, bitterly realizing the cruel reality that completely contradicted the outside world's expectations. Amidst the praises of being a model husband and having a happy family, Ki-hyeon had to silently endure the utmost pain from the brutality of his only relative. The TV screen replayed a scene of the father passionately praising his wife as the most wonderful woman in the world to polish his reputation. Ki-hyeon stood silently amid the rubble in the living room, bitterly reminiscing about the time when the entire country worshipped this man. The haggard father muttered to himself about the gambling and substance abuse scandals that he had successfully hidden under a perfect facade. He stared at the fake happy family footage on the TV and felt that the image of an exemplary father was just a cheap joke. A malicious smirk appeared on Ki-hyeon's face as he could no longer bear his relative's hypocrisy. He suddenly burst into maniacal laughter, the sound echoing throughout the dark room like a release for the resentment he had suppressed for so long. Ki-hyeon softly called out to his father in a highly sarcastic tone while constantly clutching his stomach, laughing uncontrollably at the man's pathetic state. The emaciated man turned his head with lifeless eyes, while he silently concluded that he was still the biggest actor he had ever known. His gaze focused on the sloppiness of the man who was once a national idol, a testament to the complete collapse of his character and career. Returning to reality, Do-young's family stepped into the small kitchen together, bringing along a warm atmosphere that completely contrasted with the darkness of Ki-hyeon's home. Ji-yeon looked down at the bandaged wound on her knee, gently reassuring him that it was just a minor scratch not worth worrying about. In the hospital room, Ki-hyeon looked haggard as he listened to her complain that Do-young had panicked too much and called him over, even though she only fainted for a moment. His eyes were full of pain mixed with anger, choking up as he pressed for the cause of the accident and why the one suffering was always her. Ji-yeon slightly turned her face away, revealing the truth that the motorcycle's target at that time was actually heading straight for Do-young. Ki-hyeon was stunned into silence when she recounted the moment she had panicked and pushed her friend away, only to take the impact herself. He suddenly got angry and yelled, harshly questioning why she always chose to save others without ever thinking about her own safety. His face contorted in agony, asking her if she ever truly understood who was the most worried whenever they saw her injured. Faced with the overwhelming sincerity from her best friend, Ji-yeon could only remain silent, her lips pressed tightly together in resignation. Her eyes suddenly became sharp and determined, emphasizing once again that Do-young's life was truly in serious danger at that time. Trying to force a smile, she affirmed that her actions had prevented a tragedy and that she was perfectly fine now. Ki-hyeon bowed his head apologetically by Ji-yeon's hospital bed after hearing the whole truth about the accident. He painfully exclaimed that he really didn't know what to say in the face of his best friend's reckless sacrifice. Right at that moment, hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway along with an anxious call heading toward the emergency room. The door flew open, and Do-young's family rushed in, to the astonishment of the two friends present. The father frantically checked his daughter's condition while Do-young awkwardly spoke up to confirm she was fine. She hesitantly introduced her parents to everyone, and Ki-hyeon also quickly regained his composure to offer a polite greeting. Do-young's father anxiously asked about the group's injuries and received a bright smile from Ji-yeon assuring him that she was okay. The little girl tried to lift her leg and walk around to prove to everyone that she could move perfectly normally on her own. The mother tearfully offered her sincere thanks because Ji-yeon had saved Do-young's life and kindly asked for the girl's name and age. The atmosphere suddenly became awkward as Ki-hyeon stared blankly, looking utterly shocked by these incredibly unexpected developments. Ki-hyeon politely bowed and introduced himself as Do-young's classmate, making the father extremely surprised at the teenager's tall appearance. He thoughtfully remarked that this face looked strangely familiar right as the boy restated that his name was Seo Ki-hyeon. The father shockingly realized something astounding, the bewilderment clear on his face, as if he had just discovered a huge secret. He suddenly shouted out loud in sheer amazement, causing Do-young to frantically demand her father keep calm and lower his voice. He kept yelling in excitement, repeatedly asking if this was the famous Ki-hyeon that the whole family often heard about. The mother, out of sheer embarrassment, intervened to remind her husband to stop making a scene, but he still tried to justify that everyone knew his daughter had liked this boy for a long time. The father began dreaming about the future and pressed to know if this was his future son-in-law, causing Do-young to panic and beg him not to say weird things. The little girl bowed her head in insecurity, painfully affirming that someone like her could never stand beside someone as perfect as Ki-hyeon. The father immediately objected fiercely and loudly declared that Do-young was the most beautiful girl because she inherited all her beauty from her mother. The atmosphere suddenly froze when Ki-hyeon unexpectedly appeared at the room's door, leaving Do-young's father gaping in astonishment. Ki-hyeon pressed to know why Do-young was out in the hallway while Jaeon was still inside the hospital room. The father unexpectedly pointed his finger and harshly questioned the relationship between him and his daughter, making Do-young scream in panic. The little girl tried to stop him and begged her father to stop because that action made her extremely embarrassed. Do-young feared that her father's rudeness would make someone like Ki-hyeon feel heavily insulted. Looking at his calm expression, she silently prayed that things wouldn't turn into a chaotic scene right at the hospital. The mother hurriedly intervened to defuse the situation and demanded her husband not humiliate their children. The mother sincerely apologized, explaining that he was just acting like an overly protective father to his daughter. Ki-hyeon gently corrected that they were only classmates and became close because Do-young had been his fan since childhood. With a polite demeanor, he affirmed that he completely understood and didn't mind the family's worries at all. He tactfully explained that Do-young was very lovable and emphasized that Jaeon was always present during their outings. Ki-hyeon gently advised Do-young to go home and rest because today's incident had made her too tired, and simultaneously promised to stay and take care of Jaeon. The father nodded in agreement and urged his daughter to leave quickly, leaving Do-young with no choice but to awkwardly accept in hesitation. He kindly instructed Ki-hyeon to notify him immediately if he needed any help, and asked again whether Jaeon could be discharged from the hospital yet. The father decisively pulled out money and handed it to Ki-hyeon to pay the hospital bills and catch a taxi to take his friend home, despite the confused teenager trying to find a way to refuse. Ki-hyeon softly rubbed his arm with a contemplative look, seemingly immersed in messy thoughts about the unpleasant things that had just happened. The father smiled benevolently, endlessly praising that Ki-hyeon had truly grown into an incredibly outstanding young man. Ki-hyeon bowed his head apologetically, sincerely apologizing for his somewhat rude attitude earlier and asserting that he absolutely meant no harm. Amidst the city's high-rise buildings, an exclamation rang out, remarking that the little boy from years ago had truly become a good person. In the car heading home, the mother pressed for the reason why Do-young kept her reunion with Ki-hyeon a secret, making the little girl sigh, and explain that she knew for sure her parents would overreact. The father awkwardly wondered aloud if he had acted a bit too ridiculously during their first meeting and immediately received a brutally honest nod of confirmation from his daughter. On the way home, the mother sitting in the car smiled softly and secretly rejoiced upon realizing that Ki-hyeon in real life was just as lovable as his image on TV. The car rolled through the city streets as the father boldly declared that he couldn't leave a bad impression on his future son-in-law, causing Do-young to scream in desperate protest. Do-young slightly tilted her head to look out the window with a shy smile, secretly enjoying the sweet emotions that had just kindled after the turbulent encounter. The little girl's eyes sparkled with simple happiness, her heart seemingly skipping a beat at the care that person showed her. However, her expression suddenly fell and became melancholic as her insecurities once again rose to take over her mind. In the hospital lobby, Jaeon walked with a limp, the bandage wound on her knee serving as a reminder of the painful recklessness that had just passed. Ki-hyeon stood in silence beside his best friend, the atmosphere between the two now enveloped in a troubled and awkward stillness. He unexpectedly spoke up to offer to escort her all the way home using the taxi fare Do-young's father had given, asserting that he wanted to ensure she was safe. Jaeon slightly turned her face away in sadness, decisively rejecting his kindness and stating that she could catch a ride home by herself. She looked straight into Ki-hyeon's purple eyes with a somber expression, hesitantly calling his name as if struggling to speak some heartbreaking truth. Jaeon looked straight into Ki-hyeon's eyes and decisively affirmed that she was fine in order to refuse his help. Ki-hyeon let out a gasp of astonishment, his eyes tinged with sadness at the cold rejection from his best friend. He quietly bowed his head to accept reality, softly murmuring his agreement to let her leave even though his heart was still full of turmoil. The taxi quickly rolled away from the hospital gates, leaving Ki-hyeon's solitary figure standing silently in the still night. He stood alone in front of the brightly lit building with a dazed look, seemingly immersed in an indescribable sense of emptiness. His sharp purple eyes suddenly turned dark as Ki-hyeon silently chewed on the pain and loneliness that he couldn't share with anyone. Just as he was trudging away, his phone suddenly vibrated, pulling him out of his chaotic train of thought. He slowly raised the device to check it with a curious look, secretly wondering who would send him a text message at this hour. The screen displayed a message from Chai Do-young, sincerely apologizing for the troubles that occurred earlier. Ki-hyeon stood in silence, staring at the light emitting from his phone, his heart seemingly beginning to experience strange fluctuations. Ki-hyeon ran his hand through his hair in frustration as he stood silently under the dim lights of the hospital hallway. He felt his chest tighten painfully the exact moment he read the sincere apology text from Doya. His sad purple eyes were clearly visible through his fingers as he told himself that everything that happened wasn't really that girl's fault. The image of him yelling at and blaming Doyoung came back to him as a form of self-reproach because he knew she wasn't a bad person at all. Ki-hyeon buried his face in his hands in helplessness. Even though his mind understood everything clearly, his heart still couldn't calm down. He asked himself why the presence of that little girl could make his mind so agitated. Whenever he faced Doyoung's sorrowful face, a strange, unnameable feeling would quietly rise and take over his soul. The quiet night enveloped the high-rise apartment building, where Ki-hyeon quietly returned to dwell on his own thoughts. He stepped into the empty house looking exhausted, as if the pressures from family and friends were draining all his energy. His heavy bare footsteps moving across the cold floor seemed to reflect the loneliness and exhaustion surrounding the young man. Ki-hyeon had barely arrived home when he was met by his father waiting for him, harshly questioning where he had run off to all this time. Suddenly, he lunged forward, grabbing his neck, and rained down mercilessly violent blows, leaving the young man no choice but to endure the beating in silence. Ki-hyeon looked at his father with a melancholic gaze as he heard him sarcastically remark that he hadn't actually ordered him to do anything at this hour. He wearily brushed back his messy hair, silently concluding that he had already anticipated this terrible scenario would unfold. Whenever he dared to resist or refuse to take the beating, the space of the house would turn into a battlefield with furniture shattered to pieces under his father's madness. He chose to indifferently admit that he had forgotten the order, accepting the pain just in hopes that everything would end very quickly. The father stood tall with his face contorted in anger, constantly hurling insults and calling him a massive idiot. Ki-hyeon quietly stroked his hair in humiliation as he listened to his father scream in regret for giving birth to a son like him. He stood silently in front of the glaring light from the screen, bitterly realizing the cruel reality that completely contradicted the outside world's expectations. Amidst the praises of being a model husband and having a happy family, Ki-hyeon had to silently endure the utmost pain from the brutality of his only relative. The TV screen replayed a scene of the father passionately praising his wife as the most wonderful woman in the world to polish his reputation. Ki-hyeon stood silently amid the rubble in the living room, bitterly reminiscing about the time when the entire country worshipped this man. The haggard father muttered to himself about the gambling and substance abuse scandals that he had successfully hidden under a perfect facade. He stared at the fake happy family footage on the TV and felt that the image of an exemplary father was just a cheap joke. A malicious smirk appeared on Ki-hyeon's face as he could no longer bear his relative's hypocrisy. He suddenly burst into maniacal laughter, the sound echoing throughout the dark room like a release for the resentment he had suppressed for so long. Ki-hyeon softly called out to his father in a highly sarcastic tone while constantly clutching his stomach, laughing uncontrollably at the man's pathetic state. The emaciated man turned his head with lifeless eyes, while he silently concluded that he was still the biggest actor he had ever known. His gaze focused on the sloppiness of the man who was once a national idol, a testament to the complete collapse of his character and career. Returning to reality, Do-young's family stepped into the small kitchen together, bringing along a warm atmosphere that completely contrasted with the darkness of Ki-hyeon's home. Shin Go-yoon finally collapsed on the cold floor, officially leaving Ki-hyeon alone in a haunting living hell. Even the funeral of a national actress became a nightmare when massive numbers of cameras and camera flashes surrounded every walkway. The father, Seo Ki-hyeon, decisively did not show up, leaving the reporters absorbed in weaving sensational headlines over his family's pain. Amidst the wailing of the adults, little Ki-hyeon quietly walked out of the funeral without anyone bothering to notice. The pitch-black night enveloped the building's space, where the dim streetlights cast a chillingly eerie silence. The little boy huddled and slumped down in a dark corner of the wall, burying his head in his trembling legs as if wanting to escape the cruel reality. Suddenly, a clear voice rang out from behind, as a strange little girl hesitantly called his name, with a look full of worry. The little girl froze in shock, her eyes wide open at the haggard face and teary eyes of the friend she always admired. That child naively confessed that she had always followed him on television and expressed her sincere affection for her idol. Ki-hyeon looked up with eyes marked by resentment, silently harboring a grudge that he should never have agreed to participate in those fake farces in the first place. Little Ki-hyeon bowed his head and sobbed, repeatedly saying in pain that he truly didn't want to participate in that broadcast ever again. A fit of anger erupted. He screamed right in the face of the strange little girl and forbade her from calling his name affectionately as if they were already very close. Ki-hyeon bitterly blamed the damn TV show for causing weird kids like Do-young to constantly follow and harass his life. In a state of distress, he screamed that he hated his parents and everything in the world, then desperately shooed her away to leave him alone. The poor child decisively turned his back and ran away into the darkness, leaving Do-young standing frozen in the small alley in utter shock. The sound of hurried footsteps rang out, shattering the silence of the night as the little boy tried his best to escape the harsh reality surrounding him. Ki-hyeon dashed aimlessly through the dim streets. It seemed he was trying to shake off all the chains of fame and hypocrisy. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the road with broken breaths due to exhaustion, while his little heart kept sobbing continuously from emotional wounds. With a sweat-drenched face and tear-blurred eyes, Ki-hyeon looked up at the night sky, as if wanting to seek a way out for his deadlock. He stood stark alone under the bleak streetlight, quietly looking into the distance and feeling the loneliness seeping into every breath. The memory of his mother's warm hugs and radiant smile was now just a luxurious fragment for the child sinking into melancholy. Little Ki-hyeon could only choke up in tears when having to bear psychological traumas too massive, far beyond a child's endurance. Everything around him suddenly became chaotic, leaving a solitary figure curled up in a dark corner of the wall, as if wanting to escape reality. Even when going to school, Ki-hyeon still had to endure the prying eyes and whispers from strangers about his tragic fame. His classmates only dared to stand from afar pointing fingers. Those curious to approach were made hesitant by warnings about his intimidating appearance. Do-young froze upon hearing friends recount that Ki-hyeon once ruthlessly drove away the kindness of others and affirmed he was completely far different from his image on TV. Amidst the bleak sunset enveloping the deserted playground, the silence further accentuated the loneliness of the child turned away by the world. Ki-hyeon chose to withdraw inside the dark slide tube, the only place he felt shielded from the malicious gossip of people. The little boy bowed his head in exhaustion with empty eyes, seemingly having completely given up hope for an understanding from anyone around. Suddenly Do-young appeared right in front of him, making Ki-hyeon startle in shock, marking the fateful intersection between two souls full of wounds. Ji-yeon proactively approached Ki-hyeon, who was sitting with his knees pulled up in the middle of the playground. She naively asked to confirm his identity and let him know they were actually classmates. In response to that warmth was a dark look full of hostility. Ki-hyeon coldly uttered words of dismissal, demanding she get lost immediately. Ji-yeon looked bewildered at her friend's gruff attitude. She pressed to ask whether he had rented this entire place all to himself, but only received silence. Flashing a radiant smile, the little girl nonchalantly asked Ki-hyeon whether he ever felt tired of always being all alone like that. A fit of anger erupted. Ki-hyeon stepped closer and harshly warned her to leave quickly before he started uttering terrible insults. He decisively turned his back and walked away first, leaving Ji-yeon standing in silence up high looking after her classmate's lonely figure. Looking at Ki-hyeon's sullen face under the dry sunlight, the little girl could only sigh and silently conclude that this was truly an incredibly weird child. Ki-hyeon trudged through the bleak playground, telling himself that normally, After those bitter words of dismissal, no one would dare to come near him ever again. The late-day sunlight enveloped the middle school, where he once assumed that Kim Ji-yeon was just like all the other annoying and curious kids he had met. Standing silently by the roadside with a contemplative face, Ki-hyeon immersed himself in a quiet stream of thoughts about his stormy first encounter with this special friend. Ki-hyeon stood in silence amidst the city with empty eyes, his mind seemingly completely paralyzed by reality. He secretly asked himself if he were to disappear right now, perhaps after a brief moment of pain, he would get to rest forever. The young man unconsciously stepped down into the roadway, preparing to throw himself into the danger zone as if seeking a final release. A large truck was rushing in at a wind-tearing speed right next to Ki-hyeon's lonely silhouette. In the life-or-death moment, a hand unexpectedly reached out with determination to prevent an impending tragedy. Ji-yeon risked her life to dash over, pushing Ki-hyeon far away and screaming that the action just now was truly too dangerous. Both collapsed onto the road. The little girl anxiously asked about his condition while Ki-hyeon was merely bewildered, wondering to himself why she had saved him. He coldly brushed off her caring hands, uttering harsh words of dismissal and demanding she stop bothering his life. Ji-yeon got angry and shouted loudly. She questioned whether he truly desired death that much and received a bitterly affirmative response. She looked straight at him with a determined gaze, loudly affirming that no matter how difficult it gets, thinking about giving up on life is not allowed. Ki-hyeon glared deeply into the other person, coldly pressing to ask what a girl like her would know about his scar-filled life. Ji-yeon maintained her determined gaze, nonchalantly assuming that he must have heard his friends tell everything about her background and knew clearly who she was. The young man admitted to knowing everything but still couldn't help wondering why she remained so stubborn in approaching him despite being ruthlessly shooed away. Ki-hyeon smirked with full sarcasm, concluding she must have grown up in excessive sheltering to look at life with such naive eyes. He firmly asserted that she would never be able to understand the cruel reality he was going through because she had never experienced it. Standing amidst the bleak afternoon sun, Ki-hyeon slightly bowed his head and bitterly confessed that he actually felt jealous of her happiness. He decisively turned his back and walked away, uttering insulting words that annoying kids like her were exactly the kind of people he hated the most in the world. Looking at the lonely back slowly fading away, Ki-hyeon silently blamed himself for the arrogant and mistaken prejudices he had imposed on that friend years ago. Unexpectedly, Ji-yeon stood silently and blurted out the heartbreaking truth that in reality, she too no longer had parents by her side just like him. Ki-hyeon stopped in shock with a stunned face. It seemed the barrier he had painstakingly built suddenly collapsed entirely before that confession. Ji-yeon choked up, recounting that both her parents were firefighters and they had sacrificed their lives while on a noble duty. She confessed that sometimes she felt very lonely but was always proud because they were both incredibly decent people. Ki-hyeon thoughtfully wondered why she could so frankly share that deep-seated pain with a stranger like him. With a determined gaze, Ji-yeon affirmed she did not consider her family's loss a weakness for others to pity. She looked straight at Ki-hyeon and emphasized that he did nothing wrong because the mistakes of parents inherently had nothing to do with who he was. It was that exact moment that made the young man's heart completely surrender, beginning a long-lasting, unrequited love. Hidden behind a sensitive and thorny exterior, Ki-hyeon truly only lowered his defensive weapons when he was by Ji-yeon's side. To him, she was the most important person, but now the presence of Do-young caused his mind to become agitated once again. In the dark room, Ki-hyeon sat opposite and directly pressed to ask the reason why Do-young could love him that much. He constantly questioned why the little girl always endured and accepted all the bitter words from him without ever knowing how to get angry. Do-young looked up at Ki-hyeon with teary eyes, choking up as she pressed to ask if she was truly important to him. The little girl bowed her head full of insecurity, silently thinking that her feelings inherently had no dramatic or profound details like the destined bond between him and John. Memories of the days quietly sitting in front of the TV screen flashed back, a testament to a silent love that started simply and just kept growing over the years. However, low self-esteem suddenly engulfed Do-young's mind, making her fear whether her emotions had become shallow just because of that simple beginning. Ki-hyeon sat silently opposite, It seemed he too was falling into a stream of thoughts about whether the origin of feelings dictated their depth. Do-young's face suddenly paled, the shock clearly visible on every feature as she began to doubt the value of her own love. The image of the withered falling flower seemingly reflected the humiliation gnawing at her soul, causing her agonizingly to think that her feelings for Ki-hyeon were actually just a meaningless thing. Ki-hyeon unexpectedly lowered his voice to repeat Do-young's affirmation about her biggest dream in life being to see him find happiness. The little girl slightly nodded in admission and silence, leaving her most sincere feelings to be once again exposed in front of him. Ki-hyeon suddenly steered the conversation by pressing to ask if she understood the reason why he abruptly mentioned Jaeon at this moment, leaving Do-young blankly confused. Ki-hyeon bitterly admitted his deep love for Jaeon and feared he would never be able to find happiness without her. He looked straight at Do-young with a highly desperate face, coldly declaring that he was in real need of her help. Ki-hyeon brought up Do-young's previous promise that she would never interfere in the relationship between him and that girl. Using the other person's feelings as pressure, he brazenly proposed wanting to use Do-young to achieve a certain personal goal. The sorrowful image of Jaeon appearing in his mind made Ki-hyeon painfully realize she was increasingly trying to push him out of her life. His face suddenly became sharp and lifeless, hiding the fully selfish calculations quietly rising up. His purple eyes marked with melancholy, Ki-hyeon trembling confessed the fear that was engulfing his mind every passing minute. He bowed his head in a dead end, bitterly admitting he would never be able to figure out Jaeon's secret thoughts on his own. Ki-hyeon reached his hand out toward Do-young with full determination, affirming that as long as there was even a tiny chance to hold on to Jaeon, he absolutely must take it. He pinned Do-young down to the floor with an overwhelming glare, loudly declaring that when it was for Jaeon, he had not a single shred of self-respect left to keep. Do-young's heart seemingly shattered right in front of Ki-hyeon as she bitterly realized his mind at this moment was only filled with Haeon's silhouette. The little girl agonizedly asked herself if her feelings were merely an illusion. How intense must the yearning Ki-hyeon had for the person he loved be? The kitchen space suddenly became lightened up the next morning when Ki-hyeon softly uttered an apology for his excessively abrupt visit. He politely bowed to express his gratitude while the mother kindly consoled and advised him to always keep a strong spirit to overcome difficulties. Ki-hyeon said goodbye to the family to leave, while Do-young also quickly asked her mother's permission to see her friend out. The sound of the door opening rang out, signaling a parting moment full of lingering attachments after a sleepless night with too many psychological fluctuations. Right after the door closed, Do-young's younger brother breathed a sigh of relief because, fortunately, the group had left before their father got off work and returned. Do-young sat blankly on the floor, secretly afraid of her younger brother's fierce reaction if he accidentally caught a strange guy in his sister's room. The sky outside the building had started to shine with brilliant sunlight, driving away the gloomy night and the freezing raindrops of yesterday. Do-young quietly walked behind Ki-hyeon's back under the sun. She softly called out his name, as if wanting to convey a sentiment she hadn't managed to say. Ki-hyeon turned to look at Do-young with a skeptical gaze, pressing her on how she intended to help him in this situation. He scratched his head in confusion and confessed to himself that he was inherently very poor at dealing with the people around him. Memories of last night returned hauntingly, as Ki-hyeon laughed maniacally in pain and silently blamed all his actions for being mere temporary outbursts. He painfully realized that from the past up until now, his father had always been the one to instigate all the chaos and trouble in his life. The fiery and violent arguments between father and son repeated continuously, like an endless loop, leaving him completely exhausted. Ki-hyeon felt so disgusted and tired of this reality that he wanted to let go of everything to escape the suffocation. Empty liquor bottles lay scattered on the cold floor as a testament to the young man's ultimate brokenness and loneliness. His purple eyes bloodshot with melancholy, he immersed himself in a quiet stream of thoughts filled with wounds that had never healed. In the dark corner of the room, Ki-hyeon sought alcohol as a final anesthetic to soothe the pain gnawing at his soul. He swallowed each bitter gulp of liquor, letting the bitterness soak into every cell during the solitary sleepless night. Ki-hyeon silently asked himself why he kept clinging to the booze even though he knew well it was just garbage with no good taste. He sighed softly in exhaustion as he felt the dizziness beginning to take over his already weary mind. Looking into the void, He bitterly concluded that this dead-end reality was merely an utterly meaningless joke. The sound of a door slamming echoed dryly, reflecting the suppressed rage as he decisively stepped out of his dark space. Standing silently in Do-young's room, Ki-hyeon told himself that he would only allow himself to rely on this help just this once today. He held his head in despair, admitting that if he continued to stay in that house, he would definitely cause a terrifying explosion. Ki-hyeon let out a sigh full of disappointment. It seemed all resistance against fate only made him feel drained. He turned to look at Do-young with doubt, wondering what she could do for him, but then still decided to reconsider. His deep purple eyes etched with hidden pain, Ki-hyeon quietly observed the small girl waiting for an answer. He suddenly lowered his voice in serious questioning, pressing whether she had enough courage to do exactly what he was about to ask. Under the brilliant sunlight, the school building appeared full of silence, marking the beginning of a new chapter filled with anxieties. As soon as Do-young entered the classroom, Jaeon radiantly said good morning, making the atmosphere suddenly warm. The close friend thoughtfully asked if Do-young had any trouble moving and couldn't help but worry about the condition of the wound on her leg. Jaeon's eyes suddenly flashed with extreme surprise when she noticed the pretty little item her friend was holding. Do-young stood in silence, her trembling hands tightly gripping the crimson heart keychain as if trying to protect a priceless treasure. Jaeon happily commented that this gift would look great hanging on a handbag, but Do-young expressed her fear of possibly losing it. The little girl silently confessed that this was her first time exchanging keepsakes with a friend, so she felt extremely treasured and flustered. Jaeon affectionately recalled the beautiful memories of their weekend outing and affirmed that she had some incredibly happy moments. Her gaze was full of hope as she expressed her desire that the friendship among the three of them would always be strong and beautiful like it is now. However, the harsh reality was that Do-young couldn't utter a single word to Jaeon the entire morning due to the guilt weighing heavily on her soul. Jaeon remorsefully asked herself why she had acted so recklessly, crossing the line on that fateful day. Do-young silently worried about Jaeon, who was always overly sensitive in friendships and frequently isolated herself. Jaeon choked up because she couldn't blurt out the truth about the recent conflict between her and her best friend Ki-hyeon. She wondered in bewilderment how exactly she had hurt him to make things turn out so badly. Do-young stood alone full of anxiety. She only yearned for harmony and feared her presence would make her friends feel awkward. The school hallway appeared completely deserted, enveloped by a suffocating atmosphere before an unavoidable meeting. Ki-hyeon slowly walked down the stairs, seemingly lost in his train of thought when he heard someone calling his name. He suddenly stopped and softly called out to Jaeon when he saw her standing quietly in the dim classroom. Ki-hyeon's gaze showed a serious look. He directly suggested a short talk to resolve their frictions. The two sat in silence next to each other on a stone bench under a sunlit tree, officially facing their private sorrows that couldn't yet be shared. Jaeon sat on the stone bench, gently bowing her head to apologize to Ki-hyeon and confessing that she had been a bit too sensitive on the day the incident occurred. Ki-hyeon softly replied that everything was fine, his eyes clearly showing tolerance mixed with a bit of pensiveness as he faced his close friend. Jaeon smiled radiantly again. She sent her sincere thanks for his understanding and thought that everyone would have times of emotional instability like that. Ki-hyeon confided that seeing her and Do-young holding the matching keychains together had made his heart swell with many chaotic thoughts. He bitterly admitted that he had been too careless, completely unaware that Jaeon was the one who had always worried about him the most since they were little. His purple eyes etched with deep sadness, Ki-hyeon quietly observed the expression of the girl sitting next to him with a troubled state of mind. Meanwhile, Do-young strolled alone down the sunlit school hallway, silently calling Ki-hyeon's name in a constant state of unease. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed dryly on the ground as a silhouette rushed hastily toward the little girl. Ki-hyeon suddenly appeared and wrapped his arm around Do-young's shoulders. He boldly announced to her shock that the two had officially reconciled. The young man flashed a radiant, triumphant smile under the sun, once again affirming to everyone around that the conflict between them had been completely resolved. Ki-hyeon looked at Do-young with full suspicion. He pressed her on how she intended to help him in this ironic situation. He scratched his head in confusion and confessed to himself that he was inherently extremely bad at dealing with the people around him. Memories of his manic smile yesterday returned, making Ki-hyeon silently conclude that all his actions were actually just temporary outbursts. He deeply confided that whenever he was beside Jaeon, he always yearned to be true to his own heart. Whether they were pure warm feelings or complex calculations, Ki-hyeon still wanted to face them in the most sincere way. He clearly understood there were things he couldn't resolve himself, but wondered if Do-young's help was what he needed. Ki-hyeon realized Do-young was a capable assistant as she continuously provided important news about Jaeon to help him deal with obstacles. Even the hidden things Jaeon couldn't say were seen through by him via Do-young, urging him to understand her more deeply. He silently told himself that as long as he stepped in to protect her at the right time, Jaeon would definitely see and cherish his place in her heart. Ki-hyeon gave a profound smile, boldly affirming that after all, he was the only one Jaeon truly had in this world. Do-young looked up at Ki-hyeon with sparkling eyes, silently sensing a strange shift in the atmosphere between the two. Ki-hyeon pondered for a moment, and then suddenly turned to look straight into her eyes with a totally serious expression. He gently pressed her on whether Do-young was busy after today's classes ended. With a dazzlingly enchanting smile, Ki-hyeon decisively made an offer, asking her to come with him. The little girl was so stunned that her face flushed red, stammering as she asked herself if she was truly prepared for an after-school date. The brilliant sunset sunlight enveloped the school building, signaling an afternoon full of unexpected developments. Do-young sat in silence before a lavish feast at the restaurant, feelings of being lost and confused clearly showing on her melancholic face. Ki-hyeon casually picked up food and pressed for the reason she still hadn't touched her chopsticks, snapping Do-young out of her chaotic stream of thoughts. She clumsily grabbed her cutlery, silently telling herself she had to try and eat even though her heart was racing while being alone next to the male idol. Looking at the expensive dishes laid out before her eyes, Do-young didn't know whether to laugh or cry, silently thinking she would probably have to ask her brother to increase her allowance to keep up with this lifestyle. Ki-hyeon was startled upon hearing Do-young suggest splitting the food bill. He immediately frowned, expressing extreme dissatisfaction. He decisively affirmed that he was not so pathetic as to let a girl pay after he had proactively invited her out. Faced with that determination, Do-young could only awkwardly apologize because deep down she had no intention of belittling his self-esteem. After paying, Ki-hyeon announced there was another place he wanted to drop by and urged the little girl to quickly follow him. He walked with a worldly air with his backpack on his shoulders, while Do-young hurriedly ran after him and continuously pressed him about the total of the recent bill. Returning home, Jaeon warmly informed her grandmother that dinner was ready, trying to bring a cozy atmosphere to the family. The little girl thoughtfully helped her grandmother sit up on the sickbed, her eyes clearly showing filial piety and attentive care for her relative. The grandmother sorrowfully noted that Jaeon had endured too much hardship since she was little. Just studying while taking care of the family was already overwhelming. Jaeon gently advised her grandmother not to say such words because to her, getting to take care of her grandmother was her greatest happiness and responsibility. She sighed softly when she opened the fridge and realized the food reserves were almost depleted, signaling the financial hardships that were silently closing in. Jaeon silently told herself she needed to go out and buy a few more necessities to cover the family's meals. The little girl walked alone on the deserted street with a black plastic bag in her hand, her silhouette exuding a pitifully hard-working vibe. Suddenly, Jaeon stopped in shock when she caught sight of the familiar silhouettes of her two friends walking together on the opposite side. Ki-hyeon suddenly appeared and had a rather heated argument with Do-young right on the sidewalk, leaving Jaeon completely astounded. She bewilderingly asked herself why Ki-hyeon and Do-young could appear next to each other in such a highly conflicted situation. Jaeon stood quietly watching from afar, silently recalling the words Ki-hyeon once said about having his own plans for today. Suspicion surged in the little girl's heart as she wondered whether the plan he mentioned was spending time with Do-young. Ki-hyeon tilted his head slightly with a thoughtful expression, seemingly also struggling with the chaotic emotions inside himself.